Note to self, do not go to Tijuana because what the fuck is happening there? You see the title, we are in this together. If I had to hear this story, so do you. If you do want to listen to it in Spanish though, it is from Relatos de la Noche and it is called La Habitación del Poseído. So this guy says that 20 years ago, it was around Semana Santa and something really messed up happened to him. This happened in Tijuana and he was traveling there because he needed to give some people this important document for his job. When he got to Tijuana, he realized that somebody at his job messed up with scheduling the trip and thought that he was going to pay out of pocket for everything, being that the company would just pay him back later. But he says that at the time he did not have enough money. So now not only did he have to find a hotel, but he had to find one that he could afford and that was close by the business that he had to go to the following day to take those very important documents. So he ends up telling this taxi guy the problem, and the taxi said that he knew a hotel that was close by the area that he needed to be at and that he thought that it was affordable. He also explained that he knew he was going to have problems finding a hotel because it was Semana Santa and everything looked really busy in the area. So the guy ends up taking him to this hotel and he explains how when he saw the hotel, he noticed that it was really old. Even when he went inside the hotel, all the workers treated him like it was back in the day. And he's not saying it in a negative way. On the contrary, it was a good thing because when he explained his situation to the workers, they told him that the amount of money that he had wouldn't be enough to get their last room, but maybe they would try to work with him to get him something else. They explained to him that on the last floor of the building, there was a basement, and in that basement, there are 3 bedrooms. One of the bedrooms is where they stored furniture and things like that they might use in the future, and the other 2 bedrooms is where the workers would stay if they worked overnight and needed to take a nap or anything like that. One of the 2 bedrooms was actually occupied. They were going to do him the favor letting him stay in that empty bedroom, but only if he was going to stay there to go to sleep at night. So as soon as he would wake up, he would have to go and he wouldn't be able to come back unless it was nighttime and he had to go to sleep. He did think it was weird, but he also thought that they were doing him a favor, and unfortunately he wouldn't have any of like the services that they offered at the hotel. He wouldn't even have a TV in there, but he was so desperate that he didn't want to sleep out in the street, so he agreed to stay there. So the guy who was doing him this favor called on the workers that was going to help the guy take his suitcases to the basement, and he noticed when the guy came and asked the man, are you sure we're gonna let him stay there? And the guy's like, yeah, go ahead and help him, please. He said that when the guy came to get his suitcases, he looked at him and said, are you sure you want to sleep in there? And I mean, he said yes because he had no other option. He noticed that the guy who was helping him with his suitcases was trying to start a conversation with him, but at this point it was 11 p.m. and he was so tired and he just wanted to go to sleep. When they finally got to this room, which by the way was really old and really unkept, he ended up giving the guy a tip, and the guy gets the tip but asks him if he believes in anything like weird or strange. He looks at the guy and he's like, weird things? And the guy's like, yeah, like the devil, like ghosts, like something paranormal. He just giggled a little bit because he thought this guy was playing, so he just dismissively was like, good night, like get out of this room, I'm ready to go to bed. He explains how he didn't need a backstory. He didn't need to know if like something was happening in that room or if there was ghosts in there. He didn't need to know any of it. He just wanted to go to sleep. Honestly, he travels so much and he stayed in so many hotels that he's heard so many like ghost stories that he just wasn't interested. And looking around the room, he said the only strange thing about it was that there was another door that looked to be connected to the other bedroom on the other side. However, it looked like it was cemented to the point where you couldn't open it anymore. Like there's no way to open and close. Somebody made sure to seal that door. He ends up going into the restroom, taking a shower, and as he's walking out of the restroom, he's starting to hear sounds from the room next to him that was also being occupied by somebody else. When he got closer to the door, he realized that the sound was almost coming from the top of the door, and being that he knew somebody was staying there, he didn't want to be rude, so out loud he asked if somebody was there, if somebody needed something. He heard a woman's voice respond, please help me get out of here. He looked around his room and realized that he didn't even have a phone in the bedroom to call the reception, but he needed to reassure himself that everything was okay. He kept thinking to himself, like, why is there somebody locked in there? Why is there somebody needing help? Like, this was so fucking weird. He got a little scared because he started to think of the possibilities, like, why is there a woman locked in the bedroom in the fucking basement? Like, he didn't know what to do, so he decided that he was gonna go out himself. He put his clothes back on, he put shoes on, and that is when he hears that somebody is walking through the hallway of that basement. He heard the footsteps stop in the bedroom that was next to his, and he heard when somebody opened that door, and that is when he decided to very silently open up his door to look and see who was out there. So as he's peeking, he says that there was a silence that was too quiet, and then in a split moment, somebody peeked out from that bedroom straight to where he was looking at them, and that is when he sees this very tall, fat guy just walking away from that bedroom. It was so unexpected that the guy like jolted out of the room to look at him. He literally took steps back and ended up falling on the bed. After that, all he heard was like very heavy steps going up those stairs, and he knew that the guy was headed out. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't stay still because now he's thinking, what if this fat guy is doing something to the girl that's asking for help? So he decided to run up those stairs and go to the reception desk. So he tells the reception people, hey, there's a lady asking for help next to me, and there's this guy who went out of there. I think he's keeping her locked in there. He explains how after he says this to the reception people and all the workers, there was a lot of movement. Everybody was moving, everybody was doing something, but nobody would tell him why they were all moving. That's when he notices that all of these workers were heading to the basement, and one of the reception ladies stayed there and asked him, what did the person look like that you saw in the hallway? When he described the person that he saw, this girl also ignored him, didn't say anything to him, but she started to give details to somebody on a radio. The only person who was giving him attention was that guy who had helped him with his suitcases. The guy was standing in the front of the hotel by the door smiling, but when he looked at the guy and saw that he looked really confused, he started to walk up to him to see what was happening or what he needed or if something happened. So he tells him everything that happened, and the worker ends up telling him, okay, maybe you should go sit at the bar and just get a drink while you wait, because it's gonna be a while before they bring him back to that room. He could tell that this worker wanted him to ask him more, like, what do you mean the guy has to go back in there? You're gonna put him back in the room. So before he went to the bar, he asked the guy, what do you mean get him back in the room? Like, what are you talking about? The worker tells him, the guy that talked to you through that door, the one that's staying next to you. And he tells the worker, no, that was the lady, it wasn't the guy. The worker said, no, there is no woman in there. It's the guy that you saw. Apparently, the guy had also talked to some of the workers in that woman's voice. The worker starts telling him that this guy had been in that room for a week now and they've had to deal with him, and that's when two other workers passed by, so that he had to stop talking. He gave himself a little pause. After they moved away, he almost whispered in his ear, they're waiting for them to give them authorization to do an exorcism. The worker tells him that they don't know if they're going to do the exorcism there or if they're going to take him somewhere else, but that everybody that's involved in this exorcism thing was also staying at this hotel. He tells them that the reason why they're letting them stay there was because the family of this guy that's staying next to him is friends with the owner of the hotel. He ends up giving him a sign to stop, almost telling him he didn't want to hear anything else. He tells the worker, I have to stay here too, man. Just don't tell me anything else. I don't want to know anymore. He ends up going to the bar, and by this point he had already had 2 drinks before that same guy came looking for him again. Tells them that they found the guy and everything is okay and that he can return to his room again. What the fuck, bro? I'd rather sleep on the fucking street. He asked the worker, the guy is still there, gonna stay next to me? And the worker's like, yeah, but don't worry, they already calmed him down, everything's okay. Apparently they gave him some sort of pill or something to calm him down, and he tells him, you're at the very least gonna be able to go to sleep. Am I? You think I'm gonna go to sleep? Very nervously he walked to the room again, and he said that the drinks and how tired he was ended up making him fall asleep. Bitch, I could never. However, it was a very restless night because he was having nightmares. He would end up waking up and he could swear to hear a woman singing from that room next to him. He's like, it was a woman's voice, definitely not coming from this really big, tall, fat guy that was staying next to me. He's like, if I had to bet my life on it, I would say that there was a woman in there and not this big dude. It wasn't even over then. He explains that the most terrifying thing that happened was he was awoken by this very, very deep breathing coming from inside of his bedroom, and it was almost right before the sunlight came out. He didn't have his glasses on, and he's like, thank God I didn't, because I could have sworn that when I opened my eyes there was a figure standing in the bedroom with me. He could tell that the figure was in the shape of a woman, but that her arms were very weirdly positioned, the pose was just off. He closed his eyes, started praying, and ended up falling asleep again. Until he woke up again by a really loud sound coming from next door. Bitch, I would have been out of there. When he woke up again, he remembered again about the woman, the figure in his room, and he was like, I had enough. Thankfully, I thought he was never gonna fucking leave. What the fuck? He said that he grabbed all of his stuff when it was morning, when he woke up, and he got the fuck out of there. The hotel, that place, is still open till till this day, he's like, I just Googled it. It is still running. He said that this hotel is only a few steps away from El Reloj de Mental. He's like, I'm only sharing where it's at because I wonder if anybody who hears this, who has gone around there, knows what happened to this person or what happened 20 years ago in that place. And what might have happened to that person, to that guy who was possessed. I need to stop being so nosy because of course I started reading the comments to see if anybody knew anything, but there was nothing there. Everybody was just leaving comments of how scared they were and how some of them would have just stayed on the metro bus and gone to sleep there, or you know, stayed in the center of the town. I would have been gone by the first time that the guy was like, are you sure? Why? Why? I would have already gotten all the dirt out of him. But what do you guys think?
The story I'm about to read is terrifying and true. One night, my sister, my friend, and I decided to explore an abandoned farmhouse just outside the city limits. When we first arrived, it was still light out, and the house already looked unsettling. The paint was peeling, the windows were boarded up, and the yard was completely overgrown. We decided it would be much creepier to explore in the dark, so we drove a little farther down the road and parked on the side while we waited for the sun to set. While we waited, we started talking about paranormal experiences. My sister and my friend shared stories they had heard or things that they believed in, but I didn't take any of it seriously. To me, it was just stories meant to scare people. Eventually, the sun went down and everything around us became quiet. We drove back towards the house and parked our car off the road so no one would notice it. From there, we had about a 5-minute walk to the property. The only light we had came from our phone flashlights. A couple minutes into the walk, I started hearing noises somewhere in the distance. At first, I thought it was coyotes, which wouldn't have been unusual out there. But the more I listened, the more wrong it sounded. It sounded like a person screaming, but stretched out and distorted in a way that didn't feel human. I asked my friend if she heard it, and she laughed and said, "Relax, it's probably just a flesh pedestrian." She was clearly joking, but the sound made my stomach twist. Suddenly, the darkness around us felt heavier. By the time we reached the driveway of the house, my heart was pounding. It was completely pitch black, and our flashlights barely lit up the ground in front of us. Behind us stood an old, crumbling barn, and beside it was another house that actually had a faint light on inside. Someone was living there, but we tried not to think about that. The abandoned house in front of us had every window boarded up, except for the garage entrance, where the door had fallen off. As soon as we stepped inside, our lights landed on something strange, a bike. It looked almost brand new. We nervously laughed and assumed maybe it had belonged to the people who used to live there. The weird thing was, the house still had everything inside. We slowly walked through the house. There were children's birthday cards all over the floor, family photos still hanging on the walls, and toys scattered across the floor. Normally, I find abandoned places interesting, but something about that house made me feel uneasy. I had a horrible feeling in my gut that told me we shouldn't be there. My sister, my friend, and I wandered into a smaller room that looked like it belonged to a kid. We could barely walk into the room due to toys, garbage, and random stuff scattered all over the floor. The light from our phones barely reached the walls. Then I pointed out that there was writing all over the walls. The word brat was written over and over across the walls in dark, messy writing. My eyes moved around the space until they landed on the closet. The door was slightly open, and inside was completely dark. Then I saw someone standing inside. It was a man, but something about him looked wrong. His skin was pale, and his hair hung in messy strands around his face. He looked dirty and almost inhuman. The worst part were his eyes. They were so dark, they barely reflected the light from my phone. For a second, we just stared at each other. Then I screamed. I ran out of the house as fast as I could. My sister and my friend ran right behind me. Upon exiting the house, we rapidly sprinted towards the car. As we ran, we passed the barn. The house behind it had a faint light glowing from the balcony. It appeared as if someone was watching us, but maybe I was paranoid. My sister started crying as we ran, and the 5-minute walk felt like it lasted forever. Just as we were approaching the car, headlights appeared behind us. A car was coming down the road and slowing down. We instinctively ran to the car and hid behind it. The car rolled closer until it finally stopped, right near where we were hiding. None of us moved. None of us made a sound. I wanted to jump into the car and drive off, but I couldn't make my feet move. It felt like time completely stopped. As soon as the car sped off, we wasted no time getting in the car. My friend started the engine, and we sped off down the road. After driving for a while in complete silence, we decided to go home. To this day, I still think about it, and it haunts me. But it piqued my curiosity. Was it just a homeless person? Something more sinister? Was there a person on the balcony? And what freakish animal or human was making those noises? The person who sent this to me said that they still drive by that house sometimes, but they have not gone inside since. And I think that's for the best.
Snacks in hand, the vibe is set, and once I start, don't eat too much, because you gotta stay fun, but come on, bestie, yeah! I added a little dance this time. But hey, bestie, I missed you. I got a story time for you. You got your snack? You got your rolling equipment? Okay. So for the sake of the story, let's call this girl Louisa. Also, physical ebook coming soon. Let's jump right into it. So growing up, Louisa always felt different, right? She was very aware, very sensitive. She could pick up on people's energy. Like as a child, she didn't know how or what that meant, but she just knows she could do it. Like her clarity, discernment, everything was super, super sharp as a child. She remembers thinking and knowing that she was different as a child, but doesn't really know like what that means. She just feels different, right? And as she grew up and became an adult, the older she got, the more she started to realize, like, I'm losing my gifts. Her discernment is weak. She just feels the magic being gone. But she did say, like, she went through a lot of stuff, like trauma, stress, like a lot of stuff that, you know, life will throw at you as an adult. She feels like because of those trauma and stuff like that, you know, she kind of, like, lost her gifts. And at some point, she just kind of, like, made peace with it. You know, she was okay with it. Anyway, Louisa follows me. There's nothing wrong with Louisa's life. Louisa's doing great. Louisa got her degrees. She got a great job. You know, she's doing good. But something in her spirit told her to, of course, get my ebook. So she got it. After she saw somebody else who life was perfectly fine. Nothing was wrong. And they got the ebook. I don't know if y'all remember that story time. But it, like, completely flipped their life. Anyway, so she saw that. She was like, I wonder. Like, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm pretty protected, you feel me? Like, but let's try it. So she got the book and she did the fast. Like, as soon as she got the book, that's what she was so excited about. Now, Louisa is also like a chaotic person. Like, she likes chaos, not the bad kind, but you know, she's exciting, she's adventurous, she's curious, she wants to know what's gonna happen. So she does the fast, completely expecting, you know, her life to flip upside down or something, or nothing happens. She said after 2 days after doing the fast, she woke up. Actually, no. She had a dream. That she was back home by this river, right? And she was just standing there. And there was this lady beside her. And the lady was looking at her. And when she looked at the lady made this weird face, like a disgusting face. And so she asked the lady, like, and it's as if she kind of already knew the lady. She don't know who this lady is, but in the dream, she feels very familiar to the lady. And so the lady tells her, you need to bathe. She's like, I need to bathe. The lady tells her, yes, it's time for you to bathe. And so the lady takes her to the river and gives her a bath. And she says it felt like the most relaxing, the best bath she has ever had in her life. And after that bath, she physically, spiritually, and mentally felt like cleansed and all new. But when she woke up, you expect that feeling to stay in the dream, right? No. When she woke up, she felt the same way she felt in that dream after getting that bath. Although her life wasn't bad, it seems like it got better. And not only did it seem like it got better, she felt magical again. Her gifts came back. She can feel it. She feels that magic that she felt when she was a kid again. The reason why her life is getting much better is because those gifts, I guess, are now back. Her discernment is stronger, so she makes clearer decisions. She reacts better. Intuition is on point. And now she kind of wants to explore those gifts as an adult. As a kid, she knew she was gifted, but she didn't really quite know what it was. But now she's an adult with free will. And she's very excited that the gifts came back. And now that they came back, she wants to explore them. She wants to learn about them. Listen, baby, you can do all you want. Just please don't go do spells. Don't go try and do TikTok spells. I beg you. You will never get those gifts back. But I'm glad I could help. This was a little quick story time because I'm literally outside my daughter's school about to pick her up, trying to sneak you guys a story time. And I'm about to pick her up now. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to get your own ebook. You might get your gifts back too, okay? Physical version coming soon. Link in bio. It's called Cleansed and Covered. Okay, I love you. Bye.
What do you mean it was looking at them and then they all lip gloss on so I can run this mouth. Now focus. Scary story time. Fright Night Files. So I get this email from this girl named Kelsey from Eastern Kentucky, and it is so weird. All right, listen. So she was best friends with her papa. He was 79. He recently passed away 4 months ago, but around 8 months ago, he called her and asked her to come over and go through all of the family photos because a lot of them didn't have like names written on the back. So he wanted like later generations to know who was who. She said, sounds great. I'll do you one better. We'll scan them, make an archive out of them, put them in the computer. It'll be a whole thing. She was excited about it, thought it was going to be fun. Well, everything's going great until day 2 when she finds this photo and it's of Christmas. She shows it to him and she's like, hey, you know, like when was this? And he's like, oh, that's Christmas at my parents' house. That was like 1967. And it was him, his wife, which was her grandma that's passed away like 5 years ago. And it was his brother that passed away in 2022. And then Kelsey's mom and uncle. Who's that in the background in the hallway? Who's that? So he's looking at it and he said, I don't know, maybe it's like a coat or something. Something about it didn't set with her. So she takes a photo of it with her phone and she's like zooming in. And when she zooms in, she can tell that like this is no coat. This is a person of some sort. This was a shadow thing. It had a face. You couldn't really make out the face, but it had a face. So she showed her papa, like, I don't know. That's weird. You know, like, I don't know. It doesn't make sense. So they lay it down. They keep going. 2 hours later, they find another one, but this one is at Easter. He said there were about 12 people in the photo, but in the background was that same dark, like thing, right? It was like a person, but not really, but it's still facing the camera. Like every photo that they're finding, it's facing the camera. So now they're creeped out and they switch their focus from looking at who the people are that they know to trying to find more of these photos. And she said they just kept finding like more and more and more. Like every box they opened, there was this thing like standing there. Sometimes it was like partially hidden behind a tree in a doorway, in a hallway, like around the corner, standing in the edge of the photo, but it was there in pretty much all of them. She got upset, didn't want to look at it anymore because she said she felt like she needed to call someone, but she didn't really know who to call or what to say. It was like really weird. So he tells her, you know, you just go to bed. I'll finish the rest of them by myself. He ends up staying awake the entire night. The next morning, she comes in for like coffee and he tells her, hey, sit down. I want to show you something. He had organized them all to where you could see this thing that was standing in the background that would be facing the camera, and then it would shift its gaze to like a particular person and get closer to them until that person died. And then it would go on to the next one. You guessed it. Yep. That thing was staring at him now in all of the recent photos. He told her he wasn't scared to die. That's not what he was worried about, that he was like ready for it, but that he was worried that it would shift its gaze to someone else after he died. Well, they put the photos up. They tried not to think about it. And like I said, you know, he passed 4 months ago. So right after the funeral, she told her mom, hey, this is what happened. This is what we found. So the mom immediately wants to see the photos, right? So she goes to get the photos out and guess what? That thing is gone. It's not in any of the photos anymore. It's not in any of the ones that she had uploaded to her computer. And so she's like digging, looking for the exact ones that she knew for a fact it was in, like that Christmas one and that Easter one. Gone. Her mom thinks she made it all up, and the only one that saw it was her papa, and he is passed away now. But she said she knows for a fact that she saw that. She didn't dream that up. That was a conversation they had. She knows that it was in those photos. So I want to know, has anyone else ever heard of anything like this happening before? Because I've seen like pictures of like loved ones show up in photos, but this thing followed them from like 1930 until 4 months ago. And now that all of them from the original set of photos have passed away, she thinks that maybe that's why it's gone, because the original family is no longer like with us. I don't know. I just know it's creepy. Let me know what you think.
This story is especially scary because it shows that even when you try to do the right thing, you can still bring something home. I'm gonna go ahead and tell the story in the first person, but it did not happen to me. A few days after I had just become CPR certified, I was at a grocery store with a couple of my friends. We were grabbing drinks and grabbing snacks because we were getting ready to go to the beach. When out of nowhere, a woman runs into the grocery store screaming, asking if anyone in there knew CPR. Without even like hesitating or even thinking about it, I raised my hand and I said that I did. The woman then tells me that there's a woman parked right out front that's slumped over in the front of her car, and she has her driver's side door wide open, that she looks like she's completely passed out. I run out there and I get to the woman. When I go to turn her face, I see that she is completely blue. Like there is no life left in her. I also notice that she has tears like on her cheeks. I pull her out without even thinking about it, and I start doing CPR on her, and I yell for someone to call an ambulance. As I'm doing CPR on her, I'm like looking up and down, and I noticed that there was a bunch of needles like right on the floor of like the driver's seat. There's a bunch of needles, and I also see that there's some like kid toys and a car seat, an empty car seat in the back seat. So in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, she has children. And the needles, I mean, we already know what the needles were for. Once the ambulance gets there, they take over and they do everything in their power to try to bring this woman back, but unfortunately they're not able to. They even give her a shot of Narcan, which is what's supposed to counteract the effects of her. Fortunately, they said that it was too late and she didn't make it. As terrifying as that experience was, I honestly thought that was the end of it until a few nights later. I started having dreams of the woman. At first it was just flashes of that day, then I started seeing her standing in my room, just watching me. She looked the same, blue, lifeless, but she was crying. Not loud, but it was almost like she was broken, like she was heartbroken. Anytime she would show up, I couldn't move, I was paralyzed, I couldn't speak, I couldn't react. I had to just lay there and just watch all of this unfold. Until one night I heard her whisper, "Where are my babies? Please, they need me." But then it got worse. I started to hear footsteps in the house at night. Sometimes I would hear a car door slamming right outside my house, but every time I would look outside, there was nothing there. One of the worst nights was when I woke up, I opened my eyes and I saw her literally leaning over my face, like her face was right next to mine. After that, I decided to get my pastor involved. He came over and prayed over my whole house. He says that sometimes when a person passes away suddenly, they don't know how to let go, and I might have been the last person that she had a connection with. Things have mostly stopped since he came over, but every now and then I'll still dream about her. Every single time she shows up crying, still asking for her kids. It's been a while since I've seen her, so now I am praying that I didn't just wake something up just by sending you this email.
A wealthy client of mine in Los Angeles asked me if I would feel comfortable sharing my face, and I don't know if I'm overreacting, but I feel like I was almost dragged into something that I wanted no part of. This Book is Here Storytime submission came from a co-owner of a hair salon in Los Angeles, and she said that she's been in this industry for a long time. She's had all sorts of clients, rich, famous, everything under the sun, but she's never had anything like this happen. We're going to call the girl who's in this story Cece, okay? Cece said that she didn't want to reveal her real name or her salon name for obvious reasons, okay? But it all started when this one woman walks in to her salon one day and she requests Cece by name at the reception desk. And Cece is busy with a client. Of course, she's been doing this for a long time. She has a long list of clients who come to see her regularly, and she's booked out for a while. So the receptionist relays this to this woman, and this woman's like, I really need to get in to see her, like tonight if possible. I have a big event this weekend, and I saw her Instagram, and I need her to do my hair. Cece is within earshot, but she's busying herself with her client and letting the receptionist take over, and the receptionist's like, sorry, I really can't do anything for you. She doesn't really take walk-ins. You're gonna have to make an appointment. I can put you on the list, blah, blah, blah. And the woman's like, I don't really care what it costs. If she has any cancellations, will you please have her call me before this date that weekend? So the receptionist takes her information. She's like, sure. Well, it turns out Cece does have a cancellation, and the receptionist calls, and this woman ends up coming in. When she walks in, Cece could tell that she was very wealthy. She was carrying a very nice bag. She was very well dressed, not flashy by any means, but she was also like chaotic, just chaotic energy. What they were doing to her hair was nothing dramatic. It was something Cece could handle, and she was happy to take her. But the woman sits in the chair, she asks for wine, and then she starts like spilling, and she's like, I'm so happy that you could take me. I have this big event this weekend. I work for X, Y, and Z client, big name in Hollywood. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. And Cece's like, okay. And she said that she's had entertainment industry adjacent people in there before. It's not really a big deal for her. But this woman's like, well, okay, I'll tell you. Cece said it was an impressive name, but she's just there to do her hair. She doesn't really care. And she's like, oh, okay, wow, what's the event this weekend? Is it like a red carpet event or something that you needed your hair done for? And this woman's like, no, it's nothing like that. It's one of the events that they don't photograph. Because you would be shocked at what people sign just to be in that room. And Cece's like, okay, NDA culture, you know, whatever. And this woman's like, no, I mean it. She kind of spends the rest of the appointment just like texting on her phone furiously, like she's taking phone calls, kind of obnoxious, but she could tell that she was still kind of working as she's getting her hair done. And at one point she looks up and she's looking at Cece in the mirror and she goes, do you like working here? You kind of have the face that they like. And Cece's like, yeah, you know, I've worked really hard to get where I'm at. I'm actually part owner of the salon. Mom's like, interesting. Okay, that's good. I like you, Cece. You're the type of person that doesn't ask questions. That's what they need. She said she didn't really know how to take this. She was just like, oh, okay. And this woman goes back to texting on her phone. They finish the appointment. The woman's extremely happy with it. She pays. She tips her fabulously. She leaves. Next day, she's checking her client list or appointment log or whatever terms the hair industry uses. And she sees that this woman has already made another appointment for 6 weeks from that day. She's like, okay, cool, new client, you know, whatever. And one of the girls that had been there the night before is there. And she's like, what was that lady's deal? And Cece's like, oh, she said she works for this celebrity and she had an event and I don't know, she was a little chaotic, but she was fine. The girl that works for her is like, well, does she actually work for the client? So they look her up and she in fact does work for this person. She's even in some like press photos with this celebrity. Cece's like, cool, she's legit. She's chaotic, but she's legit. 6 weeks pass, this woman comes back. She sits in Cece's chair and she starts talking to Cece like she's an old friend. And this time she also brings her own wine. So she's a little just unraveled. Cece's like, how was your event? And the woman's like, oh my gosh, it was fabulous. It went so well. It was everything that they wanted. She's just nodding. She's doing her hair, and the woman pipes up again. She goes, there's just some places that you can't go unless you're invited. And I don't mean like parties. I mean like you have to be really invited. Would you ever be interested in doing something like that? Before Cece can even answer, this woman pipes up again, and she goes, well, of course it's about confidentiality. Like, would you consider yourself a confidential person? It's not so much about talent these days. It is about compliance. She says compliance is what makes you successful. How do you feel about that, Cece? Cece goes, oh, I don't know. Like I said, I'm pretty happy where I'm at. Like, I've worked really hard to get here. And she goes again, I really like you, Cece. You're the type of person that doesn't ask too many questions, and that's what they need. Cece's just nodding along. She's thinking, like, maybe this woman is intoxicated and has no idea what's coming out of her mouth right now because she already told me that. But this woman's like, would you ever be interested in seeing the type of events that don't get photographed? And Cece's like, do you mean for work? Do you mean like you need, people that need their hair done? This woman just flatly says no. And she goes, okay, well, what do you mean then? And she goes, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. She says, why I think you would fit in there is because you're already successful. You're not desperate. And that's what they need right now. And at this point, Cece's like, who are they? So she just goes, I'm sorry, I'm really not following. And the woman goes, it's fine. And she just goes back to texting, doing the same thing, taking phone calls. They finish the appointment. Again, this woman's really happy with it. She pays, she tips generously. And then she goes, will you step outside with me for a second? I have a very personal question to ask you. Cece's thinking it has to do with an NDA. Maybe she's about to ask her to handle a celebrity client or something that requires confidentiality. So she steps outside, and there's people walking around, but nobody really within earshot. And this woman leans in and she says, you have a kid, right? And Cece, it stops her in her tracks because she has never told this woman anything about her personal life. She doesn't post her child on social media. Even if this woman did follow her on social media, it's not like she would have seen the child anywhere because she keeps it strictly professional on there. She doesn't have any photos of her child in the salon anywhere. She said she just always keeps her professional and her personal life very, very separate. And so when she says this, her stomach drops a little bit and she goes, yeah, I do. Why? And this woman goes, well, that complicates things a little bit, but it's fine. Because you would still consider yourself a confidential person though, right? And Cece's like, well, yeah, I run a business, I have to. Still kind of waiting for this offer. But the offer doesn't come. The woman says, okay, I'm going to book another appointment in like 6 weeks. I'll see you then. Thank you so much. You did great. The next time she comes in, there's no wine. There's no small talk. She just sits in the chair and she doesn't really say anything to Cece. She's just on her phone. And Cece just assumes that she's busy with work or something. And she kind of let the past conversation go, thinking again, maybe she just had a little bit too much wine. There's another client and another stylist in a chair very close to them. But after they walk away, the woman looks at Cece in the mirror and she says, would you ever feel comfortable sharing your face? Cece says, what? And she says, like lending it out. But of course there would be things that you had to sign before we got to that point. And Cece says, I'm not sure what you're inferring here. I'm sorry. Like, can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean? And the woman just looks at her and she says, I think I've already said too much. Cece tries to laugh it off, but the woman doesn't laugh. And she says, there's people in life that can get you anywhere you want to go. And all you have to do is know to say yes to the right question. She says, I can tell you're not ready. But if anyone ever asks, we just talk about hair, right, Cece? And Cece's like, yes. And then the woman stands up, like the appointment's over, even though she's not nearly done. And the woman says, I think we're done here. Cece's like, are you sure? Like, there's still a lot of stuff we have to do. And the woman says, no, I think I misjudged you. I'd like to pay, please. She pays. She tips a standard amount, not generously like she had before, and she leaves. And after that, there was no word from her, no bookings, no calls, no contact, nothing. Cece said, while it's not the scariest story, she was sharing this to see what everybody thought this woman's deal was, because when this woman left, she was like, what the actual F was that? She said it did not feel like this woman was venting. It felt like she was telling her secrets or like hinting at secrets and trying to gauge how much she would be willing to go along with. She said she has gone over it a million times in her head and still has no idea who they were and what this woman meant when she asked if she would be willing to share her face. I have another Holly Weird story coming up pretty soon for Spooky Scary Story Time, but I've been going back and forth with the lawyer trying to figure out how to tell this story without getting in trouble. So that's coming soon too.
Hello and welcome back to a series of spooky stories, The Haunted Tea Spill. The series is brought to you by all things spooky and ungodly amounts of paranormal activity. Featuring the necklace that we're always featuring. It is Women's History Month. I'm donating any commissions that I make off of this necklace specific to the Miss Foundation. It's also in my link tree. Now into the story. This is part 2 of the previous episode, story number 3. Not in Lyerly, but in the town over Summersville, we traveled to a known hotspot location called the Dead Horse Road. Why do they always have creepy names? This location has local historical significance in that 2 gay devil worshippers built this immaculate brick mansion with little to no prior training or knowledge on the top of one of Georgia's tallest mountain peaks. Surrounding this mansion was a large rose garden and a now dried up pond. This couple would lure child predators to this mansion with promises of adult fun playtime parties and sacrifice them to Satan. They'd lure predators and sacrifice them? I mean, it really seems to be doing a little bit of a service, if you ask me. Moving on. Local lore says if you dig in the dried up pond and strike red water, it'll grant you one wish. It also states stay on the path or risk losing it. The couple unfortunately perished during a raid which resulted in their death, as well as their beloved dogs. Not the dogs! Dead Horse Road is unlike any hike that I've ever been on. The climb to the location itself was dangerous, with steep slopes and a very narrow road, and an unnerving amount of mattresses, furniture, rugs, and tarp thrown into the brush over the steep slopes. We were told never to touch anything because oftentimes such items contained bodies that were discarded from the local gang/satanic cult. What? If they wanted you gone, that's where you'd end up. But I digress. When we finally hiked the outer perimeter of the location, the change was noticeable. There were no sounds of life except for the occasional lark, which was said to be the late couple's favorite bird, and the occasional dog bark, which always gave me chills. No other birds, no insects, nothing. We spent the day exploring what was left of the mansion and property, and eventually found ourselves back at our friend's van. When we tried to start up the vehicle, it wouldn't turn over. No lights, nothing. After popping the hood, they confirmed that the battery had died despite having been completely charged before we left that day. And you know, they say the spirits tend to drain the batteries. With no cell phone signal and feeling a little desperate, our friends agreed to hike down on foot in hopes of finding the rare stay police officer for a jump. While we were waiting, something in the trees caught my eye. When I turned to whatever it was, it didn't disappear right away. It was a girl who looked Hispanic and had very long, straight black hair and was staring at us from behind a tree before ducking quickly behind it and disappearing. I instantly felt like throwing up and was overwhelmed by a sense of urgency, like I had to get out of there, but I couldn't. I tried my best to focus on whatever game that worked in hopes that feeling would go away, but it didn't until we left the mountain and were back on the highway. I'm not really sure what to think about that one. That's pretty crazy. Rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the least scary, creepy, spooky, 10 being the most. If you have a story of your own that you want to submit, you can do so on the link tree in my profile. I will see y'all at the next episode. Stay spooky, friends.
Torn between two decisions, and you've always known that the best thing to do is either sleep on it, make a pros and cons list, or just meditate on it all day. Now, in this next story, I will be changing people's names, but that's exactly what happened, and she got the results she didn't think she was going to get. She was torn between two decisions, either saving money for her car or going to Vermont for her birthday. Now, she was torn between the two because she wanted to go snowboarding with her friends and they had been talking about it all year. And then the other situation was that she needed to save some money because her current car was breaking down. Most of you are going to say, well, that's no brainer, Cece. I would have chosen the car. Well, Diana wasn't leaning on going with the car. She was leaning to go with her friends to Vermont. Now, because it was all her friends and they were all going to be here all at the same time, at the same place, and it had been a long time, those were her pros and cons lists. Like, she doesn't see her friends often and they were all there at the same time. Now, her parents suggested for her to save for her car. Now, Diana didn't want to save for her car. She wanted to have some fun. Now, luckily, we all have that one grandparent that spoils us rotten. Diana had this grandparent named John. Now, John had told her, do what you want, live your life, go on an adventure. You can always buy a car. You can always take a bus. You can always take a Lyft. You can always take an Uber. Honestly, whatever grandparent this is, can you please give me a call? Because I need that kind of encouragement. For Diana, her grandfather was dying. He was very ill for some time, and the last words he told her, I will give you a sign, look for the letter, and you will find what you need. And you would think, what do you mean, I'll give you a sign? Like sign after death? Well, Diana's grandfather actually meant sign after death. Unfortunately, 2 months before going to Vermont, her grandfather had passed away, and when he passed away, she was completely devastated. She was planning to cancel the trip to Vermont, and her parents told her, don't. You already invested your money in it. Just go. You're going to need to spend some time with your friends anyway. So as they're discussing this, they're on their way to her grandparents' house to clean it out because they're planning to sell the property. Now, as they get to the house, that's when she recalls the letter that he mentioned to her, and she mentioned it to her parents, and her parents were like, that's impossible. Your grandfather hasn't been off of that bed for years. Like, he's been bedbound. And she's like, no, he told me to look for the letter. And they looked everywhere in that house for that letter that her grandfather mentioned to her, and they didn't find anything. So as they're packing the things up into the truck, she looked at the house one more time and she said, I gave up. Sorry, Grandpa. I looked for the letter. I didn't find it. And she said that out loud outside staring at the house. And that's when she had the urge to go to the bathroom out of nowhere. And she told her parents, can you give me a second? I need to go use the bathroom. And she took the keys from her mom and went inside. As she's walking towards the bathroom, that's when she heard the call. She heard her grandfather's voice call her from her grandmother's room where she used to do art. Diana could not believe what she was hearing, so when she turned to look at the door was slightly opened, and she could hear her grandfather from inside the room say, come on, Diane, it's over here, it's over here. Now, her grandfather used to call her Diane when she was about 5 years old, so for her to hear that, she knew it had to be him. So as she's walking towards the room, he tells her, it's over here, it's over here. She opened the door. There was nobody in that room. But for some odd reason, there was a letter on the floor that wasn't there previously when her parents and her was cleaning out the house. Looked around the room, there was nobody there. Absolutely nobody. There was not even furniture there. So for her to see the letter in the middle of the floor where there's no furniture, there's nobody, she found it very odd. So she decided to sit pretzel style and begin to open up the letter. And she realized there was a picture of her and her grandfather when she was 5 years old. And as she read the letter, it said, Dear Diane, I just want to tell you that I will always be there for you, even on a rainy day. And if you receive this letter, it's because it has been a rainy day for you. And all I want you to do is live your life to the fullest. I love you. Love, Grandpa John. And within the letter, there was $3,000 for a rainy day. What do you guys think that was? Do you guys really think that was Grandpa John saving the day one more time for Diana? Or do you think that was something else?
Friend who we're just going to call Tay sent us an email to tell us about how she has been plagued by the Shadowman her entire life. And she said that growing up, she did not realize that Shadowman was a worldwide phenomenon, that a lot of people see him. She said that when she was younger, access to Google and the internet was not what it is today. She said that her family did have a computer with dial-up internet, but her dad pretty much used it for work. While they were able to type reports on this computer, they still had to do all of their research via book. As she got older and gained access to things like Google, social media, she realized, oh, a lot of people are seeing what I'm seeing. She wrote in her email that even as a child, she did experience weird things. She never really saw anything, only things moving out of her peripheral vision, but nothing that really scared her. When she became a teenager, she said that's when Shadowman just was there pretty much all the time, and she would constantly see him. She said in the middle of the night, she would wake up and he would be standing at the end of her bed. When she would be at work, where she worked, there were aisles. She would look down the aisle and he would be standing at the end of the aisle, just watching her, just observing. And she said that Shadowman looks like Jeepers Creepers, just a shadow form, like the shadow of the thing from Jeepers Creepers. They said that she was at work one day and a lady comes in and she is talking to Tay's boss. She ends up telling Tay's boss, I wouldn't want to work alone with that girl because there is something really dark attached to her. Nothing she could do about it. It's just there. His boss tells her and Tay is just like, great, thanks for the advice. Other thing that Tay experienced, she said that her parents traveled a lot for work, and this was still around the time frame when parents would leave their kids at home alone if they were out of town. So one weekend comes, her parents are out of town, she has a friend stay with her, we're going to call the friend Anne. Anne and her decide that they're going to watch a movie in Tay's room, and Tay is going to put a video into the VCR. It's a flashback, right? But she's putting the video into the VCR, trying to get it to play, and she says that she and Anne from downstairs hear her mother's voice say, Hey, Tay! As her friend Anne looks at her and is like, I thought your parents were out of town. And Tay says, they are. This really freaks Tay out. So they actually both just jump into the bed, get under the covers, and just wait out the night. Now, Tay was very open about everything that she was seeing and everything that she was experiencing when she was a teenager. She told her friends, she told her parents. She would just constantly see Shadowman in her room, standing in the corner at the end of her bed. She said that there was one night when things really intensified. She was having a nightmare about Shadowman, and she said in this nightmare she's terrified, obviously, and then she hears something yelling for her to wake up, like, hey, Tay, you need to wake up, wake up, wake up. So she says she wakes up, she's covered in sweat, she looks around her room, not only is Shadowman there, but she says that there is this thing, and it's about the size of a medium dog, it looks like a spider, and it's right over her door, which is going to be the only exit to get out of her room. She said when she saw this thing, oh great, Shadowman has now brought his little pet demons to come and take my soul. And she says that as she's in her room and she's looking at Shadowman, she's looking at the spider thing, that's exactly how she felt. Like, they were there to take her. So she ends up calling out to her mom, like, Mom, like, Mom, Dad, like, please come here, like, I'm so scared. And they actually are both like, I'm not going. And then finally her mom is like, ugh, all right. So her mom starts walking towards the room. Shadowman and the spider thing disappear. Mom walks into the room and she's actually laughing because Tay is terrified. And even though Tay had been afraid before, this was like another level of fear. So Tay is like, why are you laughing at me? Tay's mom continues to laugh and just tells her, I kind of went to like this metaphysics store and I found this crystal that they said was supposed to ward off evil spirits. I put it under your bed. They said her mom just didn't do her research and definitely didn't read the fine print or like ask anyone because this thing actually attracted and intensified spirits. Tay's like, Mom, you literally put the portal to hell under my bed. Like, thanks a ton. So she ends up removing the crystal, but things are still intense. She says they're so bad, she's having such a hard time sleeping that she actually spirals into a bit of a depression. Shadowman is with her all the time. She's terrified. She told me she actually ended up taking psychology when she was in high school, and they would have to write papers, and she would write about Shadowman and kind of do like dream interpretations on her dreams about Shadowman. And the teacher that she had actually told her, look, I read your first paper, it was terrifying, you just get an A from here on out, like, I'm not reading that. One day, Tay decides that she's going to go to this psychic reader and she's going to have a reading done. She said she doesn't really trust people. She didn't really buy it, but she figured, what do I have to lose? So she goes in to have this reading done. She tells this lady nothing about Shadowman. And this lady ends up telling her, like, oh, you're being stalked by Shadowman. Tay is just thinking that's weird because I didn't even bring that up. But this psychic goes on to tell her, like, yeah, Shadowman wants you because you do have abilities. And he's actually feeding off of your depression, which is giving him power and making everything that's happening more intense. Pretty much, if you want to get this under control, then you need to get your depression under control. You don't need to give him any attention, no energy, period. So Tay decides, obviously, this is what I need to do. So she does, like, seek help, finds ways to manage her stress, manage her depression, and things like that. She says that she is now grown up, and she does still sometimes see Shadowman. Like, it's like this swirling thing out of the corner of her eye, but she just ignores it. She's just like, nope, not today. She says that sometimes she'll be in her house, she will hear things fall, break, crash. She goes into the room, nothing. She did start to think as she got older, listen, I'm going to set up cameras in my home just so I can catch these things because I need to make sure that I'm not the only one seeing it. And if I do tell somebody about it, I need to have proof that these things are happening. She didn't share these with us, but she did say she has caught things on video that when she talks about this, she's like, no, I have proof. Look at this. And she will show people and be like, this is like what I deal with. She says sometimes she can feel someone standing right behind her, feels like Shadowman. She does not acknowledge it. She's just like, hell no. She says she does have dogs, and sometimes they will just bark at the ceiling at nothing. And she's like, I'm out of here. I'm not even going to entertain this. But while she does feel like Shadowman is still around, he's definitely not as intense because she's not feeding him with her energy or her depression. So when it comes to Shadowman, aka Hatman, so many people have described seeing him, and basically he just stands there, he watches, he feeds off of fear. And shadow people are very commonly reported, but unlike some shadow people that just seem wispy, Shadowman, aka Hatman, he's very solid. You can make out exactly what he's wearing. Like she said, he looks like the shadow of the Jeepers Creepers thing. Very detailed, very solid, very three-dimensional. Theories on Hatman range from him being like an interdimensional being, to him being a demon, to him being a spirit that just feeds off of people's fear. People who put a scientific spin on Hatman, aka Shadowman, just say that this is kind of a cultural thing that has been created in the human mind via things like Freddy Krueger. A lot of times when people see him, it is during like a sleep paralysis episode. Basically just your mind conjuring Freddy Krueger. Then others will say, no, this is a real thing. This is an interdimensional being feeding off of your energy. This is a demon. This is a spirit, X, Y, and Z. I will say the amount of stories that I've gotten about Shadowman / Hatman, wow. Like, y'all are seeing this thing. But anyways, let me know what you think about that. Have you seen Hatman? I've never seen Hatman, and I'm okay with that. I'm going to keep it that way. No, thank you.
About 16 years ago, I was made redundant from a boring office job, and I fancied a change.
Love that.
I wanted something super simple that kept me active but stress-free. I applied to be a porter in a hospital. I got the job, and I got on with the majority of blokes who were already working there.
It is always usually men.
It seems a couple didn't appreciate a woman being in their environment.
Oh, interesting.
Classic. However, a lot of them took me under their wing and were brilliant to work with. A lot of people looked down their noses at porters, but this job was one of the best I've ever had. As part of our list of daily tasks, we'd get a call from a ward and have to collect in pairs a deceased body. We'd call them number 9s. And in all honesty, I quite liked being one of the team to take them on the tin trolley down to the mortuary. Felt like an honour, really. Also, I'd rather do it over some of the other staff members who had become so complacent about the job. One morning, first thing, my colleague Dave and I got sent to collect a number 9 on a ward I'd never been to before. We buzzed to gain access, but nobody was at reception. Then the door clicked. We looked at one another and opened the door, pushing the tin in as well. Still, nobody at the door. I couldn't help but notice how spacious the ward was, how eerily quiet it was, and how there was literally nobody around other than a few patients asleep in bed. Whoever had phoned for us to collect Marjorie had left the bay and bed number. It wasn't difficult to locate as she had the curtains pulled around. They did this so as to not distress the other patients due to the body being wrapped in hospital sheets, exposing nothing. We slid the tin in with us, still noticing there was no one around. I whispered to Dave, "This feels weird, don't you think?" He replied, "Yeah, kinda. Come on, kid, let's get her on the tin and get done." We got the pat slide and Dave used the sheets to pull her body towards him so I could slide the pat slide underneath her so as to transfer her with ease onto the tin. But before he managed to pull her towards himself, we heard an old woman's voice from behind the curtain say, "What are you doing?" "I can hear you." I looked at Dave with slight concern. We didn't want a random patient coming into Marjorie's space, not like this, but the voice became more firm. "What are you doing?" Dave let out a little laugh, I think because he felt uncomfortable. "Why are you laughing? I can hear you laughing," said the creepy old woman. Then, all of a sudden, we saw hands grabbing at the curtains.
Oh, God.
"I'll get you!" Still grabbing at the curtains, I said to Dave, "What? This is freaking me out." As I said that, a young woman, assuming a nurse, said, "Marjorie, what are you doing? Come away from the curtain." Marjorie. Dave and I looked at each other. I grabbed the curtain and pulled it right back. I ran out and looked around the corner. Nobody in sight. No nurse, no creepy old woman, nobody. Neither of us heard footsteps either. Nothing. Dave's face dropped. He said, "Come on, let's get out of here, hurry." We quickly got her on the tin, covered it over, and got to the doors as quickly as we could. We pressed the button to get out of there as we did. I looked back, and still nobody to be seen. We took Marjorie down to the mortuary and can say I've never transferred a number 9 so fast in my life. Respectfully, of course. I did that job for about a year and never had another job on that ward again. I have a few other spooky stories as I went to work in A&E, and I've heard many stories from colleagues too. I wonder if this will make it to the pod. Thanks, ladies.
I posted a premonition story the other day, and that sparked one of my other followers to send one in of their own. She'd like to remain anonymous, so we're just going to keep her name out of it. Back in 2012, she had just moved into a new town after a recent divorce. Nearby, there was an abandoned army camp in the woods. She says that the legend and lore of this area goes back decades. So her story takes place right in that area where there was a group of really old live oak trees. And back in the 60s, they were coined the term the hanging trees, which I'm sure you can understand why. So this is down a really dilapidated road, and right before you get to that particular spot, there's a really sharp curve. She said this was a really popular spot for a long time where kids would ride around and even have bonfires back there. So one day, she decides she's going to drive down to the lake because she wants to go fishing and clear her head. So to get there, you have to go on that very road. And she said, right when she got to that spot where there's the sharp curve, her mind goes blank. She said her vision kind of cuts out, if only just for a second. And in its place, in her mind's eye, she sees something. It was her local news channel, and the headline read, "Fatal Accident." She said she saw in the background there were 2 Chevys, one black, one white, and another vehicle mangled, and all the pieces smashed everywhere, strewn all around these trees. And then she says as fast as it happened, her vision came back and everything was normal again. But she was so shaken up and distraught from this, she pulled over to the side of the road to sort of collect herself. And guys, as she was catching her breath, 2 Chevys came flying and drifting around that curve. One black, one white. They were coming from the other direction, racing around this turn. And she said, even despite the fact that she had been pulled totally off the road, they just missed hitting her and then just kept flying down the road. She says if she would not have pulled over, she would have absolutely been hit by those 2 vehicles. She was so terrified and shaking so bad, she just turned around and went home. She says she definitely had an angel watching over her that day. How freaking crazy is that? Thank God for that premonition. I'm sure she'll be checking the comments. Let us both know what your thoughts are. And if you have your own creepy story time, I would love to hear it. And if you're new here, you gotta follow for more creepy story time.
Let's read another scary story. This one was submitted by Allie. I don't know if anyone will believe this, but I truly believe what I heard along with my cousin and cat was real. It began on a regular night. I was just on my phone around 10:23 p.m. before getting ready for bed. Just as a note, I slept on one side of the bed and my cousin slept on the other, but her head was where my feet would normally be. I went through my usual routine before going to sleep. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something. It started with light taps, like the kind of soft knock someone might make before entering a classroom. I was startled and suddenly very aware of my surroundings. I lay there scanning the room, thinking it was probably just in my head, until I heard it again. The taps slowly became louder, maybe even more frequent. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I looked over to where the moonlight was shining through the curtains in my room. There was no one there, so I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me and tried to go back to sleep. But it wasn't over. I woke up again maybe 1 or 2 hours later, and this time I heard knocking on my window. I was terrified, but I've always heard you should never respond. Just pretend you didn't hear anything and convince yourself it's all in your head. Except this time it wasn't. My cat suddenly jumped in a frightened movement as whatever was outside started banging on the window. I leaned over while laying in bed to see if my cousin was awake, since she usually stays up all night, but it looked like she was asleep. I didn't know what to do. The banging just kept going, getting louder and louder. I looked toward the same spot where the moonlight was shining through the window, and there was no shadow. For context, I have a clear view of that area and would have been able to see if someone was standing outside, but there was nothing. Then it suddenly stopped. I thought it was finally over, but then 3 loud bangs slammed against the window, one after the other. After that, it was like whatever had been outside just left. I felt relieved, but I was still too paranoid to fall back asleep. I hid under my blanket and just hoped I could make it until sunrise. When I woke up around 9 a.m., my cousin was awake too, so I told her everything that had happened. She looked at me and said, "I heard it too." She told me she had tried to peek and get a glimpse of whatever might have been outside, but there was nothing there, not even a shadow. That night still has me thinking about what might have been on the other side of that window. What terrifies me even more is knowing that my window could have easily been opened because it was unlocked. I've experienced paranormal things before, but this didn't feel like just some kind of ghost. I don't know what to think or believe, but whatever I experienced that night, whatever was out there, it felt like it was watching me and my cousin. I did end up telling my parents about what happened, and they believed me immediately. My dad cleansed my room afterward and prayed over us. It's been about 11 months since that incident, but every night I still get the feeling that someone is outside my window. Sometimes it even feels like my cat can see it, but I can't. I definitely feel like animals have the ability to see and hear things that we can't, so I don't doubt that your cat can probably see whatever this is. But just the fact that you guys both heard it, both you and your cousin, is absolutely insane, and there was no shadow or no sign that anyone was actually there knocking on the window. Absolutely terrifying, and I hope you never experience something like this again. Thanks again for submitting this story. If you guys have any stories you'd like me to read, please email them to me and I will get to them if I can, and I will see you in the next one.
My name is Maria, and I'm from Chicago. At the time, I was working and had just bought my very first car. I can honestly say my life felt very sad during that period. I was going through other problems, and I was very depressed. After a while of having my car, the right back tire kept getting flat. It happened 3 times, and it was always that same tire. I also started noticing that I could never keep money. My paychecks were gone the same week I received them. Something inside me started to feel weird, like a bad vibe. I ignored that feeling because I was already dealing with so much. Everything began to consume me. I kept asking God why I was going through this and what was happening to me. I would pray here and there, but the frustration kept building because nothing ever seemed to change. One day, stupidly, I asked La Santa Muerte to help me out. I continued with my week, but I quickly regretted what I did and asked God for forgiveness because I was just mentally exhausted. One night, while my sister and I were stopped at an intersection on the way to pick up her kids, I looked to my right to read the street signs. That's when I noticed something strange. Standing beside a light pole was a tall, dark figure. So tall, it nearly reached the street sign. Its entire form was pitch black. As I stared, I realized it was looking directly in my direction. When the light changed and my sister began to drive away, I watched as the figure suddenly started running in the same direction we were going. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. It didn't turn a corner or move out of sight. It simply disappeared. I asked my sister if she saw it, and she said no. I felt scared, but I told myself maybe I was just imagining things. Later that week, I started dreaming about her, La Santa Muerte. Then I saw her again on my way to the store one night. It was dark, and when I looked in my rear view mirror, I thought I saw her in the back seat. That same day, I drove home as fast as I could. I sat in my room and spoke out loud. I said, "Te respeto mucho, pero perdón por pedirte algo que no quiero de ti. Gracias. I respect you very much, but I'm sorry for asking you for something I don't want from you. Thank you." After that, I went to a brujo to get a limpia, a spiritual cleansing. He had an altar for her, and I immediately felt heavy. He told me not to be scared. I explained what I had done, and he told me, "Con ella no se juega, ni se le pide." You don't play with her or ask her for things. While he was doing the cleansing, he also told me that one of my ex-best friends had me tied to la Santa Muerte because she wanted me dead and didn't want me to have anything good. He said it wasn't a coincidence that I was dreaming and seeing things. After that cleansing, I haven't seen her again.
There's a Walmart in Galveston, Texas. It's probably the most haunted place in America. And most people don't even know that it's there. Now, you have to understand the history of Galveston, Texas. In the 1900s, there was a giant hurricane that basically put the whole city underwater. And you had over 6,000 people who passed away. Now, where this Walmart is built, during that time of the hurricane, there was an orphanage. And when the hurricane hit, it completely put the orphanage underwater. 100 people at that orphanage passed away. 90 children and 10 nuns. And it's said that the spirit of those children still haunt that Walmart to this day. Now, if you go to this Walmart, you'll notice that it's kind of eerie. And they close at 10 p.m. The people that work there do not like to stay late because a lot of weird things happen, such as toys turning on by themselves, hearing children's laughter, seeing children running through the aisles. Now, there was a story from one of the workers who worked the night shift. They were restocking the children's area where the toys are located. And as this worker goes over to their pallet, they begin to hear children laughing and they hear all these toys turning on. So they go over to this aisle and they see about 6 or 7 children playing with all the toys. And they're dressed in 1900s looking clothing. And so this employee runs and gets the GM and tells him, like, hey, there's something weird happening in the toy aisle. So the GM follows this employee to the aisle. And when they get there, there's no children. But there are all these toys laid out on the floor as if someone was playing with them. So what do you think? Is the Walmart in Galveston haunted? We've had a recent Mantis mantid creature sighting in Arkansas just the other night at the Buffalo River National Park. Now, there was a hiker who wishes to be unnamed who was on the Lost Valley Trail. And they said they were near a waterfall and they were right next to the river when they see these 2 large mantis humanoid looking creatures bent over drinking from the river. And that's when they noticed that these 2 creatures were doing something with the water, but they couldn't quite figure out what was going on. These 2 creatures then seemed to notice this hiker. And he said that's when they made their way into the water and they slowly disappeared. And he said even though they were gone, they still felt like they were there. Their presence was there. And they could hear vocalizations of these clicking sounds. So, what do you think? Is the Mantis Man in Arkansas?
We visited the very haunted Stanley Hotel. This past weekend during spring break, my lovely husband loves me so much and he drove me 16 hours from San Antonio, Texas, all the way up to Estes Park, Colorado. The Stanley Hotel is popular because this is where Stephen King himself got the idea to write the book, The Shining. We did do the Shining tour. I wanted to know a lot of information, learn the differences between the book and the film, and it was amazing. Now, although this is not where the film was filmed, the Stanley Hotel put so much money into this restroom to make it look 100% like the replica from the one in the movie. The hotel had a lot of memorabilia and they were actually very informative. I did not know that Jack Torrance, the character in The Shining, is actually meant to be Stephen King. The bar scene in the film actually happened in real life, only obviously the bartender was not a ghost. I'm not sure if you can see, but this is a The Shining poster and it is signed by Jack Nicholson. And this is the TV series poster. Now again, the Stanley Hotel is not where the movie The Shining was filmed, but it is where the TV series The Shining was filmed. And you cannot tell me that this whole bedroom isn't iconic. Now, although, again, this is not where the movie was filmed, this is where Stephen King got so frightened and so scared that he literally wrote the entire book in like a day. And although the hotel is very gorgeous, very beautiful, you can definitely feel heaviness, eeriness, and you can't deny that this place is not haunted. This is us with our wristbands. I really wanted to do the paranormal tour, but we couldn't because we did take our babies. But doing the Shining tour was amazing. It was a 10 out of 10 experience. If you are a lover of true horror, Stephen King, and even the movie The Shining, I 100% recommend. You will learn so much. And honestly, who else can say that their husband is willing to drive them 16 hours just to go visit the infamous hotel?
What are your opinions on haunted dolls? Well, this one behind me, called Stumpy, a ventriloquist dummy, allegedly came from the northwest of England and used to be taken to the pub by a man who randomly started to do ventriloquism in front of fellow pub goers. But the puppet was a little too good and some believed it was possessed. So much so that accusations began, and those that began to accuse Stumpy of being alive got terrible pains in their arms and legs. Legend has it, if you lay a finger upon him today, you will still get that same pain. So, what do you make of him? Shall we have a closer look? Oh, he is eerie. And here he is, locked away in a cupboard because he's in bygone times in Chorley, an antique centre. And apparently people were going up to him and getting either a fright because they were getting touched, or they were getting this shooting pain in their arm, the very same arm which he has missing, his left arm. Ooh. What are your opinions of this? Would you open the glass and hold the doll? I would.
I need to tell you this ghost story. This story was sent into my email, and if you have any ghost stories, paranormal experiences, or scary stories that you'd like to share, you can send them to the email in my bio. This story happened to me and two of my friends about 2 years ago, and before I even start, I want to say this. We all heard it. Multiple people were there, and there's even a video of it. It happened in late August, when the nights were just starting to get cooler, and the wind would move through the trees outside. The kind of night where the air feels a little restless. That night, my friend Brooklyn was in her bedroom talking on the phone with her boyfriend. She was lying in bed when she leaned over to turn on the light next to her. And that's when she saw it. Standing in the corner of her room was a shadow figure, not a shadow from an object, not something cast by a light outside. It was a full figure. She told us that it was so tall that its head was pressed against the ceiling, tilted slightly to the side, almost like its neck was bent, just enough so it could fit, and it was just staring down at her.
She said that in the moment she saw it, her entire body froze. She immediately dove under her covers and stayed there, holding her breath, hoping that if she didn't move, it would go away. She didn't come out from under the blanket for the rest of the night. And the next day, she told me everything, and she described it, the way it stood in the corner, the way its head was crooked against the ceiling. I immediately felt uneasy. I told her that if something like that was in her room, she needed to cast it out. I told her to pray and to command it to leave, so that's exactly what she tried to do. She looked up a prayer online and began speaking out loud in her room, trying to get whatever it was to leave. But when she was describing it later, she realized something. She had been asking it to leave, not demanding it. After that night, things didn't get any better. They got worse. The shadow figure started appearing more often. Sometimes it would be in the same corner. Other times, she would catch it standing near the door or along the wall. It never ran. It never moved quickly. It would just stand there, watching her. This started happening multiple times a week. And eventually, my friend became so scared that she didn't even want to be alone in her own room anymore. After hearing about it so many times, I finally decided we needed to figure out what this thing actually was. So I suggested something that, looking back, probably wasn't the best idea. I suggested we try a seance. The idea was simple. If something was there, we wanted to communicate with it. We wanted to know why it was attached to my friend and what it wanted. So one night, the three of us, me, my friend Brooklyn, and our friend Jules, sat down in her room to try it. The house was quiet. The only other living thing there were her 2 chocolate labs, and they were both locked in their kennels in another room. We set everything up, started trying to communicate. At first, nothing happened. We asked questions, we waited, we listened, and then something happened that none of us could explain. While we were recording, we heard a sound, a loud, strange noise that came from somewhere inside the house. You can actually hear it in the video. The moment we heard it, the energy in the room changed instantly, and all 3 of us froze. And after that, we were completely freaked out. That's when we decided to just stop messing with it altogether. No more seances. No more trying to communicate with whatever was there. But even after we stopped, Brooklyn said she could still feel it. She didn't always see the shadow anymore, but she felt like she was constantly being watched, like there was always something standing just out of sight. So for a while, we just tried to ignore it, until one day something clicked. We were all hanging out together when I jokingly said something to her. You know, I bet that thing used to watch you when you had your loft bed too. She had recently switched from a loft bed to a normal bed on the floor, and I meant it as a joke, but the second I said it, she went quiet. And then she looked at me and said, "Oh my God." I asked her what was wrong, and that's when she told me something that made my stomach drop. She said, "When I had my loft bed, I used to see a head watching me." She told me this had happened when she was around 10 years old. At the time, she convinced herself it was just her imagination, but her loft bed had been almost touching the ceiling, and the head she saw was in that same corner, same spot where she later started seeing the tall shadow figure, neck slightly crooked, looking down at her.
In the early afternoon on April 13th, 1985, 60-year-old Dorothy Thompson walked into a bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. Her hip was really bothering her, so she was moving slowly, but at the same time, she was also trying extra hard not to limp or seem unsteady. She knew the people in her small town liked to gossip about her, and so she didn't want to give them anything new to talk about. But, as expected, despite her best efforts to conceal her slower, sort of limpy movement, when she got into the lobby, the handful of tellers and customers that were inside looked towards her, took stock of her, and began whispering. So the little town of St. Bernard was about 5 miles outside of New Orleans, and it was the kind of place where people were generally pretty friendly and everyone seemed to know everyone. But this smallness made it pretty easy for rumors to spread. And most of those rumors in this town seemed to be about Dorothy. Dorothy did have to admit, though, that she had given people a lot to talk about. Dorothy, who had lived in this town for 39 years, was the owner of the town's pet cemetery. Now, this pet cemetery was actually a true business. Dorothy made her income from pet owners, buying plots of land in the cemetery. But that wasn't really the thing that made, Dorothy stand out as the centerpiece of gossip. It was the fact that she not only owned this pet cemetery, but she lived on the cemetery by herself. And considering the fact that the cemetery also had a rumor of being haunted, it just seemed like, how could anybody do that? How could she live there full time? And these ghost stories, surrounding this pet cemetery were not just, to do with animals that had been buried there, but they were about people. Because people had died on this property, including both of Dorothy's husbands. The first husband was a very heavy drinker who regularly abused Dorothy. And it got so bad at a certain point that she eventually just shot him in self-defense and killed him. So that's how he died. And then her second husband had died from suicide. And Dorothy was the one who actually found his body on the porch. And so these deaths had led to more stories about Dorothy and how she was some kind of husband killer. But what people didn't see was how much all this death really weighed on her. And when her mother died about 6 years ago, it had almost broken Dorothy completely. Dorothy and her mother were incredibly close, and after she died, Dorothy got so depressed that she had to be admitted to the hospital for quite a while. She was doing better now, but some days were still really hard. And so now, at the bank, Dorothy ignored the look she got as she approached the teller. She needed to get cash out to pay her handyman, Kenny Pommier, who had done some work at the cemetery that morning. And because Dorothy didn't actually drive, Kenny was also her chauffeur for the day, and he was outside right now waiting to take her on a few more errands. So Dorothy told the teller how much money she needed, and then after they counted it out and handed it to her, Dorothy took the cash, turned around, and headed back outside. A couple hours later, around 4 p.m., Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Kenny's car as he drove down a highway. They had just wrapped up at the grocery store, and now he was taking her back home. As they drove, the two made some small talk, mostly about the weather and also the work that Kenny had done that morning on the grounds. But the truth was, Dorothy didn't really know Kenny at all. I mean, she had just hired him the day before. But he seemed nice enough, and she was hoping he would stick around for a while. After all, she had had a pretty high turnover rate amongst her handymen over the last year, and so she was hoping now for some consistency. So both the pet cemetery itself and Dorothy's house, which again was on the cemetery grounds, required a lot of upkeep that Dorothy was just not physically capable of doing. Besides her bad hip, she also took medication for her depression that made her weak and sometimes very disoriented. Now, sometimes Dorothy would ask her neighbors for help, but generally speaking, she preferred to just hire people to do the work because, people needed steady work, she could give that to them, and she appreciated the help. However, the problem with hiring these handymen was that unfortunately, a few of her, former handymen had turned out to be criminals. Last fall, her handyman at the time, this guy named Elkin Childress, had lived with her and worked on the grounds, but Elkin was always just sort of wandering around and exploring the property instead of taking care of it. Then she had found out he'd been arrested for robbery, so she guessed that what he was really doing when he was walking around was casing the place, looking for ways to break in or to steal something. Luckily for her, he actually quit before she had to fire him. And the guy before Elkin was even worse. His name was Brandon Nodier. Brandon was a total loudmouth who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother had died. He and his wife Bonnie had moved in with Dorothy, so Brandon could keep up with the repairs while Bonnie drove Dorothy around. But, just like Elkin, the issue she ran into with the Nodiers was theft. The previous spring, Dorothy had had this really intense depressive episode and was taking a lot of medication for it. And while she was all, medicated and groggy, the Nodiers convinced her to sell them her land for basically nothing. But when Dorothy realized what had happened, she made the Nodiers move out and then got a lawyer to overturn the deal that she had signed. And so since last year, Dorothy, along with the Nodiers, had been in this horrible legal fight over this land. And she knew, the Nodiers, Brandon and Bonnie, were furious at her. And on top of that, Brandon, who was this huge loudmouth, just would not stop talking about this dispute. Not only was he talking about it in public, but he also kept contacting Dorothy to sort of talk her into dropping the suit altogether. But Dorothy was not about to drop this issue. I mean, this cemetery and the land had belonged to her mother, and now it was hers. Like, it mattered to her. She's not just gonna give it up. And so now, sitting in the passenger seat of the car, Dorothy watched as Kenny turned off the highway and eventually pulled into her driveway, which was quite long and wound through some thick woods, because remember, she lives on the cemetery. It's sort of secluded from society. And as the pair drove along this driveway and got closer and closer to her home, eventually she could finally see some of the tombstones up ahead. This cemetery was enormous, and basically any kind of animal you could imagine was buried here. Some of the graves were just engraved stone slabs, but others were pretty extravagant, including one human-sized Buddhist statue of somebody's pet cat. Kenny finally pulled up in front of the house and got out to help Dorothy carry in the groceries. And when he was done, Dorothy handed over the cash that she owed him and said she would call him when she had more work.
Might have known the story of real-life boogeyman.
And she watched as Kenny got back in his car and drove off back down the driveway. Around 9 p.m. that night, Dorothy poured herself a healthy glass of wine and went to her bedroom to turn on the TV. She'd spent the evening going through some bills and taking calls from cemetery clients, so by now she was exhausted. But as soon as she got into bed, she heard a phone ring on the other side of the house. Dorothy groaned and took her wine with her as she shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen to answer the call. And when she answered it, she heard her friend's voice, a woman named Patricia Newman. So Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, and the two of them had been introduced by a mutual friend 3 years earlier. Patricia had started out as more of a caretaker for Dorothy, since Patricia had experience working with the elderly. But they'd gotten along really well and became quite close, to the point where they had sort of a mother-daughter type of relationship. And since Patricia only lived about 10 minutes away, Dorothy did depend on her pretty much daily for things like supervising her medication and driving her to appointments. In many ways, Patricia was like the one person outside of the hired help that she did spend a lot of time with. And so that's actually why Patricia was calling now. She wanted to know if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the following day. And Dorothy said that she did and said thank you. And then the two talked for a bit longer before ultimately saying goodnight. After that, Dorothy hung up the phone and then poured herself a bit more wine. And then she just kind of stood in the kitchen for a bit, listening to the crickets outside. And then, when she was about to finally leave and go back to bed, she heard something. It was the sound of a car making their way slowly up her long driveway. The following morning, a little after 1 p.m., the friend, Patricia Newman, pulled up outside of Dorothy's house and threw her car into park. Patricia had called Dorothy around 9 a.m. that morning to tell her she was going to be late getting her, but Dorothy hadn't answered. Patricia had tried calling a few more times, but Dorothy never answered, which ultimately made Patricia pretty nervous. Dorothy was a heavy drinker in her 60s and was on a lot of medication. So deep down, Patricia knew it was possible Dorothy wasn't answering because she'd had some kind of accident or medical emergency. So she was at Dorothy's now, not so much to take her on her errands for the day, but just to make sure she was okay. Patricia got out of her car and hurried up to Dorothy's front door. But when she knocked, there was no answer. And after looking in a few windows, she didn't see Dorothy or any kind of movement inside. It just seemed very quiet and still. Patricia went back to the front door and tried it, but she found it was locked. So she just kept on knocking for a while. And after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and not hearing or seeing any sign of life in there, Patricia felt worried enough that she left the front door and went to go call the police. Not long after that, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, this time watching anxiously as two police officers forced Dorothy's back door open. The officers had gotten there just a few minutes ago, and Patricia had explained to them how Dorothy, could be inside and very likely was hurt or something was wrong here. And so the officers kind of fanned out and began searching around the house looking for a way in, and they found the back door was not locked, it was just jammed. So now they were in the process of getting it unjammed. And so finally, after a few swift kicks to this door, it finally gave way and it swung open, and the two officers, along with Patricia, went inside. Patricia immediately began yelling out Dorothy's name and going room to room looking for her, and what she quickly realized is she could hear the sound of a television that was on, and it was coming from Dorothy's bedroom. But when she went to the bedroom and looked inside, Dorothy wasn't in there. In fact, after searching the whole house, there was no sign of Dorothy anywhere. And there wasn't any sign of any kind of problem in the house, like there was no disturbance anywhere, no struggle, no accident where somebody fell over. It was just like Dorothy was gone, and that was it. Now, for the two officers, they didn't really know what to make of this, because to them, it didn't appear like anything horrible had happened. There was no active emergency here. It's just that, this person has left their TV on and they're not here when they should be. And that was concerning, but not enough to warrant a big reaction from authorities. But Patricia, she knew, based on what she was seeing, that this was so uncharacteristic of Dorothy that something definitely had gone wrong here. But even though Patricia really adamantly communicated that concern to the two officers, they just told her that, let's wait, give it a few days, and give Dorothy another couple of calls, and if she doesn't show up in the next few days, come talk to us. And so, after the police left, despite Patricia having this sense that something's off here, she did what she was told. She went home, she continued trying Dorothy, but never got an answer. She called around town to see if anybody had seen her or heard from her, but no, nobody knew where she was. And so finally, after 4 days, Patricia put in another call to the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office. And this time, she absolutely begged them to do something, because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and now Patricia was 100% certain that something bad had to have happened to her. At around 10:30 a.m. on the same day that Patricia has made this plea for help 4 days after Dorothy had inexplicably gone missing, Detective Brian Vallelongo drove his cruiser through Dorothy Thompson's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Terrence Strata. Both men worked for the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office, and they had been tasked to look into Dorothy's disappearance. Vallelongo hadn't even gotten to the scene yet, but he was already uneasy as he drove past the animal tombstones and grave sites. This place had always creeped him out. Finally, the officer's cruiser made their way all the way to the end of the driveway, and they reached Dorothy's home. And right away, Vallelongo could see there was a woman, maybe in her 30s, who he guessed was Patricia, who was standing by the front door. She seemed visibly anxious and impatient as she stood there waiting for Vallelongo and Strata to get out of their car. And when they did get out and walked over to her, she got straight to the point. She said the last officers had not actually done a real search of the place, just a sort of basic welfare check. And so now she needed them to do a full search of Dorothy's house and her grounds to make sure Dorothy really wasn't somewhere on this property. Vallelongo and Strata assured her that they would do that. But first, they needed her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia seemed pretty irritated by this and said she'd already told the officers everything she had known, both on the phone call and then previously with those other officers who had done the welfare check. Like, can we please just get into the search? But Vallelongo insisted and said, look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please, give me some information. And so, begrudgingly, she would tell Vallelongo what she knew. Basically that she had called her friend on the 13th at night to ask if Dorothy would need a ride to the pharmacy the next day. She had said yes. And then the next day comes around and Patricia calls her friend to confirm she's going to swing by and pick her up that morning. But Dorothy doesn't answer. And so eventually Patricia goes to the house. Dorothy apparently isn't there. She knocks on the door. Dorothy doesn't come out. It just seemed off. And so Patricia calls the police. They show up. They find the back door is unlocked, but jammed. They force it open. They go inside and, nothing's disturbed. And Dorothy is just missing. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And so now Patricia was convinced that something bad had happened to Dorothy. And she really was hoping that they could help her. Vallelongo nodded and then asked Patricia if maybe Dorothy had friends or family that she might have just gone to stay with. But Patricia immediately shook her head and said no. Dorothy was pretty much alone in the world and almost never left her house. And she didn't have a car because she didn't drive. Also, Patricia said she had already called around and nobody had seen her. Friends, family, no one. And then at this point, Patricia was very clear. She told the officers that she believed the only reason Dorothy would have left her house that day or that night before was if somebody else had forced her to. Vallelongo shot Strata a look. He didn't doubt that Patricia was worried about her friend, but they need to look around before they jump to any conclusions here. So he asked Patricia if she could show them the unlocked door, and they would begin their investigation. Moments later, Vallelongo stepped into the home through that back entrance, followed by Strata and Patricia. As he walked around the house, he saw that, like Patricia had said, it was very neat and tidy. There really was no sign of anything that had gone wrong inside the house. No sign of a struggle or a fall of some kind. It was just like the house was left exactly as is. That sort of contradicted Patricia's theory that, the only way Dorothy would have left the house was if she had been forced, suggesting some form of a struggle. But at the same time, what Patricia was saying about Dorothy is that she was kind of frail. And so Vallelongo thought, okay, maybe it's possible that she was forced and, she didn't put up any kind of a fight, and that's why we don't see any disturbance. He didn't know, but it just seemed odd that nothing had been displaced if we're talking about some form of an abduction. Also, as Vallelongo continued his walk around the house, he could see that items of value, like Dorothy's TV, were still there. So it didn't seem like this had been a robbery. But unlike the first officers who had done that initial welfare check with Patricia a few days earlier, Vallelongo did agree that something wasn't right here. Because as he continued to walk around, he kept seeing signs that Dorothy had clearly not planned to leave her home or had left in a hurry. For example, there was a half-empty glass of wine in the kitchen, and the television in the bedroom was still on. And so those are things that simply would not be if somebody was planning to leave for any extended period of time. And also, based on what Patricia had told them, he could rule out a family emergency suddenly taking Dorothy out of town or any kind of last-minute trip, because Patricia had called around and that stuff hadn't happened. At a certain point, Vallelongo stopped walking around the home and just asked Patricia, how was Dorothy's mental state? And Patricia clearly hesitated for a second before she admitted to Vallelongo that, Dorothy was on a whole bunch of medication, and sometimes it did make her mental state kind of foggy. And so Vallelongo naturally thought, okay, maybe it's possible that in a sort of foggy mental state, maybe for whatever reason, she wandered out of the house on her own. And then once she was outside, something happened to her, whether it was, an animal, a person, a fall, like anything could have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during that initial police welfare check. And even though he knew the door apparently had been jammed, it clearly had not been jammed so much that it prevented them from getting inside. And so maybe that door just always got stuck, and maybe that's all that happened. She walked out the back door, and when she shut it, it got jammed, and that was normal. And so Vallelongo turned to his partner and sort of explained to him his theory around Dorothy maybe wandering out on her own, and then something else happened once she was outside, and said, hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her. "15 days later, a little past 7 a.m. on May 3rd, 1985, Vallelongo stepped into Strada's office to give him an update on the case. At this point, Vallelongo thought it was extremely likely that foul play was involved here, because they had searched Dorothy's house and her property a few times at this point, and they had not found Dorothy anywhere, or any evidence to explain what had happened to her. Patricia had mentioned that Dorothy had a tattoo of a cross on her left index finger. So Vallelongo had spent the last couple of weeks calling around to local hospitals and morgues to see if any women had been brought in with that marking. Vallelongo also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors and the tellers at that bank that she had gone to shortly before she vanished, and also he had interviewed some people in town who just knew who she was. He'd also tracked down Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Pommier, who the bank had said was with Dorothy on the day she vanished. He apparently was driving her around. But none of these people had heard from Dorothy since she vanished 20 days earlier, same as Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and really couldn't offer all that much information to help the investigation, it was like everybody Vallelongo spoke to had a pretty strong negative opinion of Dorothy. Like that she was this recluse and that she was kind of crazy, and people thought she had murdered her husbands and buried their bodies in the pet cemetery, and also her house and her land were haunted. But, none of these rumors were going to do anything to advance the case. But it was interesting to Vallelongo that people felt this way about her. The only real lead that Vallelongo got was something he got from speaking to Dorothy's lawyer a few days ago, who had mentioned that Dorothy was in the middle of this very contentious lawsuit over the rights to her property with a pair of former employees named Bonnie and Brandon Nodier. And since Dorothy's case was looking more and more like an abduction or even homicide, the fact that there was this active lawsuit that Dorothy was embroiled in was a big red flag. So Vallelongo naturally knew he had to speak to Bonnie and Brandon. But as Vallelongo sat across from Strada at his desk and filled him in on all this, Strada's phone rang. Strada picked it up and listened to the person on the other end, and immediately there was this look of shock that came over his face. Strada thanked the caller and then hung up, and then told Vallelongo that a body had been found in the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from here, and they thought it could be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Vallelongo and Strada stood with Patricia Newman inside of an exam room at the coroner's office. In front of them was a long metal table, and lying on this table was the body of the woman who had been found inside the river. Patricia had been asked to come in here and see if this was Dorothy. But as Vallelongo looked at the body, he didn't see how Patricia was going to be able to do that, because the body was already incredibly decomposed and very bloated. The medical examiner had said this woman had likely been in the water for weeks, and they hadn't done an autopsy yet, but any findings would probably just be a guess because of how badly damaged and decomposed the body was. The only thing they did know for sure was that this definitely was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag tied over her head, and she was wrapped in a lot of very heavy chains, probably to weigh her down so her body would not float up and be found. And so Vallelongo looked over at Patricia, who looked visibly anxious as she stared at this body. She seemed kind of overwhelmed by the moment. She was shaking and she was just staring, sort of shocked. But eventually, after looking at the body, she spoke. And she actually said that she didn't think this was Dorothy. And for a second, Vallelongo was actually disappointed, not because he was hoping Dorothy was dead, but for the sake of the case, to figure out where she had gone. But then he remembered something. He stepped up to the body, he put on a glove, and gently examined the woman's left hand. And there, just visible on her index finger, was a tattoo of a cross. This was Dorothy. 4 days later, on May 7th, Vallelongo got to his office and sat down at his desk to start the day. And he had a lot to do, because he was now in the middle of a homicide case. The medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Dorothy didn't find any water in her lungs. So as a result, they had decided the cause of death was most likely asphyxia from strangulation or suffocation, not drowning. Now, Vallelongo had known all along that it was possible somebody had abducted Dorothy from her home and killed her. But now that it was official, he was sort of reviewing the case notes from the beginning to see if anything had been overlooked while this was still basically considered a missing persons case. And he started with the place Dorothy was last known to be, her house. Dorothy's home was incredibly neat and undisturbed, so it was possible Dorothy was lured from her home and killed somewhere else. But Vallelongo knew from talking to her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was, naturally pretty reclusive and did not leave her house easily. So it sort of made the most sense to him that Dorothy must have actually been killed in her home, and the reason the crime scene was so pristine was that Dorothy was overpowered really quickly. Now, originally, Vallelongo had considered Dorothy's current handyman, Kenny Pommier, to be a suspect, since he was the last one to see her alive, because he was the one who dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., around the time she went missing. But Vallelongo had revisited Kenny and found that he had an alibi. But even if he didn't have an alibi, Vallelongo wasn't really sure what Kenny's motive would even have been. I mean, there'd been no sign of a robbery inside of her house, and on top of that, it just didn't seem like Dorothy had much money to begin with, like she wasn't wealthy. And also the way she died, strangulation or suffocation, that's so personal, and so whoever would have done that would have had to have a reason for it. But so far, Vallelongo had not spoken to anyone who really had a serious issue with Dorothy. I mean, people definitely had opinions about Dorothy, but it was almost like people said, stay away from her. She lives on haunted land and she's killed her husbands, but it just seemed like rumor mill. There didn't seem to be somebody who really had a targeted issue with her. There was that outstanding lawsuit with the Nodiers, the two people who were, battling over the rights to her property, but it wasn't clear to Vallelongo if in the middle of this lawsuit was like real hatred between the parties. He had yet to see that. And so at this point, Vallelongo felt like his biggest problem was that he really had no real evidence. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly at this point, and they hadn't found anything useful. And there were no forensics on Dorothy's body. Since her body had been in the water for so long, all the forensics had been washed away. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and an officer poked his head in and told Vallelongo that he had something that he might want to come see. And so Vallelongo got up and he walked over, and the officer said that they had just brought this guy in for writing bad checks, and it turns out his former employer was Dorothy Thompson. Vallelongo was immediately interested and asked for more information, and the officer told him that this man's name was Elkin Childress, and he had been the live-in caretaker for Dorothy for 2 months last fall. And Elkin had told the officers who had arrested him that the reason he had wanted to work there at the pet cemetery for Dorothy was to find the treasure. Apparently, along with all the other rumors about Dorothy, there was another rumor that hundreds of thousands of dollars were, buried somewhere on Dorothy's property. And Elkin had become obsessed with finding it, but he said he never did. When Vallelongo heard this, he felt his pulse pick up. He'd never heard this treasure rumor, but it wasn't any crazier than any of the other rumors he had heard about Dorothy. And if Elkin was that serious about finding, said treasure, maybe he'd gone to Dorothy and tried to force her to tell him where it was. But before he could say or do anything, the officer told Vallelongo not to get too excited, because Elkin had an alibi for the night Dorothy went missing, and it checked out. However, the officer said that Elkin had mentioned something else that could help with the investigation. According to Elkin, there was somebody in Dorothy's life who befriended her for the sole purpose of trying to inherit everything she owned. And that person was Patricia Newman. And as soon as the officer said that, Vallelongo's gears in his head began to turn, and he thought, why didn't I see this before? After all, it was Patricia who called the authorities. She's also the one who aggressively pushed this investigation in the early days, which, Vallelongo had assumed was just because she was worried about her friend. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was trying to make herself look innocent. It's not unusual for killers to try and insert themselves into investigations to seem cooperative or to cast suspicion on other people. Patricia had also entered Dorothy's house multiple times before Dorothy's body was found, which certainly gave her an opportunity to interact with the scene and potentially hide evidence. And so Vallelongo turned and ran to go find Strata. They needed to speak to Patricia immediately, and this time it would be as a suspect. On May 8th, so 6 days after Dorothy was found in the river, Vallelongo once again met with Dorothy's close friend, Patricia Newman. But this time, the meeting was inside of a police interrogation room. And as Vallelongo sat at the interrogation table looking at Patricia, he was watching her very carefully. She did seem somewhat annoyed that she had been called in for this, but she also seemed very nervous. In particular, she kept fidgeting with her hands. Now, Vallelongo had really considered his approach here. Since Patricia could have been lying to him this whole time, his plan was to start off pleasant and kind of lull her into a false sense of security that he believed everything she had said was true so far. And then at some point he would surprise her with a sharp left turn and see how she reacted. So he started with some background questions about Patricia's relationship with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia explained how she and Dorothy were good friends and Patricia also took care of her. But then, kind of out of nowhere, Vallelongo asked her about Dorothy's estate and if it was valuable or not. She did say that Dorothy owned the house and the land it was on outright, so no mortgages or anything, so it had to be worth something, but she didn't know how much it was worth. Vallelongo responded to this by saying, okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? At that point, Vallelongo could clearly see, Patricia realizing what was happening here. She had this alarmed look on her face, like she was starting to see that she was not being treated like a witness, but rather a suspect. And so Patricia quickly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she kind of turned it around on Vallelongo and said, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Notiers. Now, Vallelongo knew who she was referencing. These were the folks who were embroiled in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she went missing and was found dead. But Vallelongo didn't say anything. He just sort of gave Patricia a look like, oh, explain what you mean. And so Patricia took the cue and told him that the Notiers had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years, and they were complete monsters. She said that Brandon had been verbally abusive towards Dorothy while he worked for her, and also he was one of the main people spreading all these rumors about Dorothy in town, about how he thought she killed her husbands and how her land was haunted and she was crazy. But she said that wasn't even the worst of it. She said Brandon was also a thief. She said the year before, when Dorothy was on a lot of medication for depression, like more than normal, and she was not of sound mind as a result of it, she said that Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced her to sign over her property to them for basically nothing. And that's when it hit Vallelongo. Like, he was aware that there had been this lawsuit over the land, but he didn't really have all the details about it. He just knew there was some dispute. And he also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Notiers days ago, but that was also right before Dorothy's body had turned up, and things had been sort of hectic, and so Vallelongo had not followed up with her lawyers yet. And so he didn't really have the context of, how nasty this legal fight really was. Patricia said she had convinced Dorothy to get a lawyer and to fight this, that it was not right they were doing this to her. And Dorothy had done that. She'd gotten a lawyer, and in fact, her and the Notiers' court date had happened just 10 days before Dorothy went missing. As Vallelongo was listening, it was like he couldn't believe it. This was so obvious, and it was right in front of him the whole time. The Notiers would clearly benefit from Dorothy's disappearance, and pretty clearly, there was real beef between the parties. So at this point, Vallelongo kind of shifted tactics and was less interested in looking at Patricia as a suspect, and instead assured her that, he would speak to them. Now, Vallelongo did speak to Patricia for a bit longer. I mean, she was still a suspect. She was very close to Dorothy, who was this older woman with no obvious heirs, and Vallelongo had not seen Dorothy's will yet, but, he wouldn't be that surprised if Patricia was in there. And if she was, that would prove she would have also benefited from Dorothy's demise, just like the Notiers would. But regardless, Vallelongo knew he was well overdue for a conversation with the Notiers. So they were going to be his next call. 3 days later, in the afternoon on May 10th, Vallelongo found himself back in the precinct's interrogation room, but this time it was a bit more crowded. He'd managed to track down 31-year-old Brandon Notier for an interview, and while Brandon had agreed to talk to Vallelongo, he had also insisted on having his lawyer present as well, which immediately signaled to Vallelongo that Brandon likely had something to hide here. Vallelongo had looked into Brandon's background since speaking to Patricia, and he found out that Brandon had a criminal record, which included assault. Vallelongo also spoke to a few people in town about Brandon, and he had been told that Brandon apparently had a very hard time keeping his mouth shut. He apparently consistently seemed to threaten or go off on people whenever he got even marginally upset. He was a hothead and a loudmouth. So, given all this, Vallelongo expected Brandon to be at least somewhat antagonistic or defensive in this interview. But when Vallelongo asked him about this, highly contentious lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon didn't seem like an angry loudmouth at all. Instead, he just seemed confused. He explained the whole thing really was just a big misunderstanding. Brandon said he and his wife had known Dorothy for 6 years and actually lived with her for part of the time. And from his point of view, he thought, Dorothy viewed them as sort of like family. And that's also why he said he believed she was selling them her land at such a low rate. It was like a family discount. He said it just sort of seemed like she really wanted them to have her property. And it was actually Brandon and his wife that had sort of insisted on paying for it. Brandon said, everything about this transaction had really been fine and above board until Patricia Newman got involved. Brandon seemed very frustrated as he began to explain how he didn't really know what had happened, but Patricia somehow got into Dorothy's head and convinced her that he and his wife Bonnie had somehow taken advantage of Dorothy. And Brandon saying that didn't happen. That's not how this went. Brandon said, as far as he was concerned, it actually seemed like Patricia was the one who was taking advantage of Dorothy. And then he said there were actually all these times when apparently Patricia was staying with Dorothy, and at some point they would get into some kind of fight, and Patricia would get mad at Dorothy, and Dorothy would flee her own house and run to the Nodier's house, for protection, for safe haven. They said that was fairly common. Patricia was this awful person that, Dorothy had to flee from. As Vallelongo heard this, he kind of didn't know what to think. Brandon could be lying to him, but truthfully, Brandon seemed very convincing. And also, Brandon just didn't really seem smart enough to be a master manipulator here. In fact, if anything, Brandon seemed kind of dense, and it was hard to believe he could engineer this murder without leaving behind any evidence or witnesses, and then also concoct this sort of brilliant story about how Patricia really was the one behind this whole thing. But Brandon's wife, Bonnie, was a suspect too. And it was possible that, she was the ringleader and Brandon had just sort of followed along. They were divorced now, but if they were wrapped up in this lawsuit with Dorothy together, it was possible they could have, come together and joined forces to take care of the problem, i.e. get rid of Dorothy. All that's to say, Vallelongo was not going to eliminate Brandon as a suspect just yet, but he needed more evidence before he could connect him to the crime. So ultimately, he told Brandon he could leave and that he would be in touch. And then Vallelongo watched as Brandon and his lawyer stood up and filed out of the room. It was sort of funny in a dark way that just a few days ago, Vallelongo couldn't see any reason why anybody would want to kill Dorothy. And now it was like everybody in Dorothy's life, Elkin, Patricia, and now the Nodiers, wanted Dorothy's money and so really would benefit if she went away. And so now he just had to figure out who wanted Dorothy gone the most. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Vallelongo stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery along with Sergeant Strada in total disbelief. Because all around them, almost every single tombstone had been completely smashed. Now, Vallelongo had no idea who had done this, but it was sort of oddly fitting, because just like this cemetery, Vallelongo's homicide case was a complete and total mess. Since May, Vallelongo and some other investigators had questioned both Patricia and Brandon Nodier multiple times, but all they ever did was point the finger at the other one. And now, the two primary suspects in Dorothy's murder were essentially at war over her property. After Dorothy's will was read, it would turn out that Patricia Newman had inherited a huge chunk of her estate, including whatever proceeds came from the cemetery business. But the Nodiers were saying that no, you cannot just give that to Patricia because the property is theirs and so the business is theirs because Dorothy had signed it all over to them. And the lawsuit to overturn that sale, despite it being very contentious, it had not been resolved yet. So you can't just shuffle it over to Patricia. And on top of that, Bonnie Nodier, Brandon's ex-wife, had literally moved into Dorothy's house, making it even more complicated. And so that was why the St. Bernard Sheriff's Department and the state police were at the pet cemetery right now. Patricia was there and trying to get access to the house since she needed to get some of Dorothy's things, and Bonnie wouldn't let her in. Now, the uniformed officers had just gone there to make sure everybody played nice. But Vallelongo and Strada had tagged along specifically to try to ask Bonnie a few questions. Now, Bonnie was still very much a suspect in Dorothy's murder, but so far, investigators had actually not been able to interview her. And Vallelongo had hoped that maybe this was their chance. However, when they arrived, Bonnie was extremely angry and she refused to speak to anyone and told all the officers and Patricia to get off her property. And even though the officers, along with Patricia, had eventually gotten inside, and Patricia took what she needed, the officers had not been able to get Bonnie to say anything to them. She refused. And so now, Vallelongo and Strada walked back to their cruiser, past all these shattered tombstones, feeling very frustrated that they had multiple suspects here and no way to eliminate any of them. Brandon Nodier would directly benefit from Dorothy's death, because if she was dead, then the lawsuit he was embroiled in would get dropped, and he would by default take control of Dorothy's land. He also had a criminal record, and according to Patricia, had been horrible to Dorothy when they lived together. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, could have helped him do it too, since after all, she was named in that lawsuit as well. And she had taken full control of Dorothy's house after she died, so clearly she was intent on living there. But Patricia also could have been highly motivated to get Dorothy out of the picture, since she was named in the will. And she'd seemed really controlling of Dorothy and had repeatedly inserted herself into the investigation. And then there was the handyman, Elkin Childress, who had been eliminated through his alibi, but Vallelongo felt like he deserved another look. He had admitted that he was obsessed with finding treasure on Dorothy's property. And now all the gravestones were mysteriously smashed, which could indicate that maybe he had come back and this was, part of his attempt to find the treasure. Maybe they were inside the gravestones. Then again, if they're going to treat Elkin like a suspect, well, then anybody who had heard rumors about the treasure on Dorothy's land was also a suspect. And considering how the residents of St. Bernard clearly gossiped a lot about Dorothy, it seemed like that would mean basically everyone in town was a suspect. But without any forensic evidence or witnesses, Vallelongo didn't see how they would ever be able to connect anybody to this crime. Still, he and Strada got back in the cruiser and headed back to the station to keep at it. The investigative team kept working this case diligently for weeks and then months, interviewing and re-interviewing suspects and speaking to people who knew Dorothy. They even met with a psychic who claimed she knew who the killer was. And some people even called in with tips that they had seen Dorothy's ghost in the area, and they would even go follow up in case maybe Dorothy was there. But none of that went anywhere. None of it amounted to any new, meaningful evidence that the police could actually use to bring somebody to court. And as time went on, Dorothy's case changed hands multiple times before finally going cold. "24 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Duran sat at his desk in the St. Bernard's police precinct doing some paperwork. And he just put his pen down and leaned back in his chair to take a break when another detective poked his head in and told Duran, hey, the caller was on the phone. And Duran knew exactly who he was talking about. A few days ago, an anonymous caller had put in a tip to say he had information about an old cold case from 1985, the murder of the lady who owned that pet cemetery. And Duran had known immediately that the caller was talking about Dorothy Thompson. Duran had actually used to cut the grass at the pet cemetery when he was 15 years old, and so he and his friends knew all about Dorothy. How she was, this eccentric recluse who potentially murdered people and who turned up dead one day. But during the first call, this tipster had gotten spooked and hung up without giving his name. And as soon as Duran picked up the phone to speak to the caller, he immediately said, whoever this is, you're not going to get in any trouble here. We just want your name and your location. I want to come talk to you and just hear what you know. You're not going to get in any trouble. Can you do that? There was a pause, and then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Duran and another detective sat in the living room of a New Orleans home, right across from a very fidgety-looking older man. The man's eyes kept darting all around the room, and periodically he kept looking over his shoulder, like somebody was gonna, jump out at him. And it occurred to Duran as he was watching this guy that he didn't just seem nervous, about the information he was gonna spill to them. He actually seemed pretty genuinely terrified. But finally, the man took a steadying breath and said he knew who killed Dorothy, and he had known for years. Now, the guilt of knowing was haunting him, literally. He told the detectives that he had been seeing Dorothy's ghost covered in chains and asking him to come forward. Now, at this, Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically, but didn't say anything. This was a pretty crazy start to the story and pretty hard to believe. But at the same time, it didn't really matter what, prompted this guy to come forward. It mattered what he had to say. And so, with an open mind, Duran, along with his partner, just sat there and waited. And eventually, the old man, despite being very scared and timid, finally did just come out and say what he knew. Based on a decades-long investigation and multiple confessions, Here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dorothy Thompson on the night of April 13th, 1985. Sometime after 9 p.m. that night, the killer was sitting behind the wheel of their truck, making their way up the long, winding driveway through the woods towards Dorothy's house. And as they drove along, the killer found themselves sort of looking out the window and taking in the sights, the tombstones, the trees, the house up ahead, the whole property, taking it all in. And as they did that, they thought to themselves that it was time to stop waiting for their fortune to arrive. They needed to take it. Because Dorothy did not deserve to have this. In fact, the killer believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live. And so the killer eventually arrived right outside of Dorothy's house, and they stopped their truck, they threw it in park, and then, calm as can be, they got out, and they walked around to the back of the house. There, they knocked. And eventually, Dorothy, made her way to the door, and she looked out through the glass, and she saw this person, the killer, and she looked confused. But it didn't stop her from opening the door. And as soon as she did, the killer didn't hesitate. They jumped on top of her. Dorothy tried to scream, but the killer immediately wrapped their hands tight around her throat, and she went silent. And then in silence, they strangled Dorothy until she stopped moving. Then, once Dorothy was crumpled, lifeless on the ground, the killer found some sheets and wrapped them around Dorothy's body and then dragged her outside to the waiting truck. Once they put Dorothy's body in the truck, they drove to a section of the Mississippi River not far from Dorothy's house. There, the killer got out, and they grabbed Dorothy's body, and they tied her hands and her feet together, and also, just in case, put a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then they wrapped her body in chains. And then once she was all prepped, the killer, calm as can be, lifted her body up, walked over to the Mississippi River, and threw her in. Moments later, the killer was back inside their truck, driving along, feeling better than they had in months. Because now that Dorothy was gone, all their problems were solved. It would turn out Dorothy Thompson's killer was indeed Brandon Nodier. He had not only tricked Dorothy into selling him her land at a very cheap price, but also, when she figured out he had basically conned her, she sued him at Patricia's urging. And when that happened, Brandon thought, okay, well, if I just kill Dorothy before this lawsuit gets dismissed, because they're going to figure out that this was not fair, that I did con her, if I kill her now, well, by default, the charges get dropped and the sale goes to me. The property is mine. On the night of the murder, Brandon was not alone. He actually asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a guy named James Tregler, to come along with him and basically just wait in the car. And so he had done that. Now, Brandon was an incredibly violent person, and he did not think twice about murdering Dorothy to make sure the lawsuit got dropped. But Brandon also had a famously big mouth, and he told his entire friend group what he had done. And so basically, all of Brandon's friends were aware of this horrible crime, and they totally believed what he said because they were fully capable of him being able to commit extreme violence, but they were scared of him. And that's why none of the friends came forward to say, what they knew. But finally, one of these friends was so haunted by their knowledge of this crime that they did eventually come forward. That was the caller who, told the detectives what happened. And in their rendition of what happened, they said Brandon didn't act alone. There was somebody else, a guy named James Tregler. And so as a result of that tip, it would take another 4 years, but they would ultimately speak to James Tregler, and he would confess to having been there on that night. And with that, they had enough evidence to finally charge Brandon for the murder. Brandon ultimately surrendered to authorities in 2012, and he would get a 10-year sentence for pleading guilty to Dorothy's murder. Brandon's ex-wife, Bonnie, was not involved. As for James Tregler, the other handyman who drove with Brandon on the night of the murder, he always maintained that he didn't know the murder was going to happen, and so he was given immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. Even though the pet cemetery is still standing today, it's now abandoned and totally overgrown. However, treasure hunters continue to walk around the property, with their metal detectors, hoping that they'll be the ones to finally find the treasure that's buried there.
Do you believe in ghosts? In 1991, a man named Alan Mann was convinced that his house was haunted. Alan worked nights, and so during the day he was mostly alone. But one day, when he was sleeping, he felt a very strange female presence coming into his room. he turned around and he saw a female, but when he got up and walked to the door, she was just gone. He checked all throughout the house, but all of the doors were locked and he was completely alone, so he didn't really know what was going on. He told his parents, he said, "Hey, I think our house is haunted," and they were like, "Nope, it's not." Now, his parents continued to not believe him, but eventually he would get married. His wife, Linda, would move in with him and his parents into this house. One night, Linda was staying up watching TV with her mother-in-law when suddenly they saw a weird shape at the end of the couch. Now, it seemed as if the dog noticed it at first and started barking or like having some kind of reaction to this. And when Alan, I think that's his name, yes, Alan, when his mom looked over, she saw this weird misty type figure and she thought it was just smoke, but eventually it also just kind of vanished. Now, right away, they start figuring, okay, maybe this house is in fact haunted, but they talked to Alan's dad and he still didn't believe them. But they decided to get in touch with a friend who had a Ouija board, and so they started trying to contact the spirit. They came up with the name Kramer. Now, Alan's dad still did not believe him. He still was not convinced that this house was haunted. His name was David, and David one day was walking around the halls when all of a sudden he started feeling something strange. And then all of a sudden, this voice came out of nowhere into his head and gave him the name Isabella. Strange things kept happening throughout the house, but then suddenly one night, Alan and Linda were having a conversation when out of nowhere, Linda kind of snapped. They were having a very normal conversation, and then Linda just got this look on her face and had this like evil laugh and just started attacking Alan. This was really out of character for her. She was not someone who would do this at all. And so while she was attacking him, Alan was trying to get her off, and he pushed her up against the wall and like he says he slammed her against the wall 3 times before she finally snapped out of it. And then when she snapped out of it, she just continued on the conversation like nothing had happened. Linda also said that she had no idea what happened. Like, she has no recollection of this happening. At this point, the family's like, okay, this ghost is evil. So they contacted a spiritualist who came up with the name Isabella Kramer. Now, it is important to note that there is no record of an Isabella Kramer living in this house, but they did figure out that this house was built on a cemetery, but the bodies from that cemetery had been moved. But anyway, the spiritualist came up with an idea. She said to put salt all over the house and also sleep with bags of salt under their bed. They also said, the spiritualist or the psychic also said that they should probably do an exorcism of some kind, but none of this seemed to work. So eventually they call a priest, and the haunting does seem to subside after the priest has been there. But even after the haunting kind of seems to go away, the family was like, listen, we're going to get out of here, which I don't blame them. I would be terrified. But while they were packing, Linda, Alan's wife, is cursing and swearing at the ghost when all of a sudden a light bulb that was in an unplugged lamp explodes and starts on fire. Later on, there was a paranormal investigative team that came in and set up a whole bunch of like equipment to kind of see what was going on here. They did say that in Linda and Alan's room, that's where they caught the most paranormal activity. They also caught this picture, and you can kind of see it looks like the shape of a person. The camera was sent off to see if something had happened with the camera to create this, but there was nothing wrong with the camera, and they believe that they caught the picture of the entity. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that the family was actually haunted by something, or was this all in their imagination? Personally, I do believe in spirits, but most of the time I think it can all be explained away. But what are your thoughts on this? Let me know down in the comments, and follow for more spooky things. Ghost stories are my absolutely favorite, and I feel like you need to hear about this one. Fort Delaware is considered one of the most haunted places in all of the United States, and it stands to reason because it's been around for a really long time, and a lot of life has been lost here. This fortress was built in the early 1800s, and it was used in the American Civil War. It housed Confederate soldiers, and after the war, there was about 33,000 prisoners there, at least from what I read. I could be completely wrong, but it is said that there were 33,000 prisoners here. 2,400 of them lost their lives while they were staying. Now, the prisoners weren't held in the, inside the fort itself. They were actually in the barracks that were located elsewhere on the island. But on the island, you can also find living quarters, offices, and a kitchen and a mess hall. Now, allegedly, this place is really haunted, and if so much life has been lost here, it kind of it makes sense as to why. But several of the places that are haunted, one of the places is the kitchen, where they say that there is a cold spot around the stove. Now, one of the areas that sees the most activity is in the kitchen. There is said to be a woman who is still there, and things will move on their own, like kitchen utensils will kind of just disappear or move on their own, which is kind of creepy, but this is one of the most active places in the entire area. There is also a lot of talk about Confederate soldiers who are still wandering the area trying to escape, actually. And one of the stories is really sad, and that is of an 11-year-old drummer boy who tried to escape from this place. He said that they say, the legend says anyway, that he pretended to be passed, like he pretended like he was passed, and then they put him in a coffin, and he was trying to get back across. They would take these coffins across the river, and then there were some sympathizers who were going to let him out, but there was a shift change, and so he wasn't able to be let out of this coffin, and so he was buried alive. And they say that this little drummer boy still roams the area, which is absolutely heartbreaking, because who would take an 11-year-old boy and put him in prison like that? That makes no sense. People have also claimed to see a bearded man dressed in uniform wandering around the powder magazine and dungeon area. He was allegedly taken prisoner during the war and then thrown into this area, and he made multiple attempts, sorry that was my dryer, but he made multiple attempts to escape and tried to get the prisoners to escape as well, and he would sadly pass away due to illness. On some of the staircases, people have claimed to be touched by things that they could not see, which is really creepy, but they've also heard screams, which genuinely creeps me out, and I think because of that I would not be able to go to this place. Now, it is important to state that as far as the 11-year-old boy, I should have mentioned this earlier, but as far as the 11-year-old boy, there is no record of that actually happening, and so I think it's just a legend, but it is really sad. There have been several paranormal groups that have come to investigate this place, and they did get a picture. I don't know if this is the exact picture, but you can see that there is like a figure there, and they were using digital cameras during this time, but they claim to have captured a ghost. But would you go check this place out? You can tour it. There are haunted tours that you can go on, and I'm just gonna skip on this one. I'm good. I don't want something following me home. But what are your thoughts on it? Would you go check it out? Let me know down in the comments, and follow for more spooky things.
In honor of Women's History Month, I'm doing 31 Days of Women in Horror. Right now, one of the biggest rising stars in horror is Jenna Ortega. But her journey into the genre started way before Wednesday. In 2013, Jenna Ortega played Annie in Insidious 2. She continued playing darker roles throughout the 2010s, such as in the thriller You, where she played Ellie Alves. But everything changed in the 2020s. In 2020, she played in the horror comedy The Babysitter Killer Queen. Then came 2022, which was a massive year for Jenna Ortega's horror career. In 2022, she starred as Tara Carpenter in the movie Scream. She starred as Tara Carpenter in Scream 6. That same year, she starred in TOS slasher X. Then in 2022, Jenna Ortega became a pop icon when she starred as Wednesday Addams in the series Wednesday. In 2024, she joined the Tim Burton world, starring as Astrid Dietz in Beetlejuice. Then last year in 2025, she starred in the dark thriller Death of a Unicorn. And Ortega is not slowing down anytime soon. It's also said that she's going to be starring in a remake of the psychological thriller Single White Female, bringing the cult classic to a brand new generation. Just a few years in her career, Jenna Ortega has already become the face of modern horror for Gen Z. And something tells me we're only seeing the beginning of her Scream Queen era. Come back tomorrow for my 31 Days of Women in Horror for Women's History Month.